Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. So, let's go. It was late at night when we decided to take the detour. Our GPS had failed us, and the route we were on seemed to stretch endlessly through empty roads surrounded by dense forest. No towns, no signs of life. Just trees pressing in on both sides, their twisted branches clawing at the moonlight. We had been driving for hours, and the darkness seemed to thicken with every mile. My friend Alex was behind the wheel, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. The others, Emily, Jake, and Sam, sat silently in the back, the only sounds being the hum of the engine and the occasional hiss of tires against wet asphalt. Suddenly, the road curved sharply, leading us off into an overgrown gravel path barely wide enough for the car. A broken sign stood crooked in the bushes, its lettering faded and illegible. The forest swallowed the path ahead, dark and tangled. "We should turn back," I said, my voice wavering. Alex shook his head. "We're almost there," he said, though his words lacked conviction. The journey became unsettling as we continued. No sign of any familiar landmarks, no houses, no other cars, only the oppressive stillness of the woods. The headlights barely cut through the shadows ahead, making it impossible to see what lay beyond. Each turn seemed to take us deeper into an endless maze of trees. After a while, we came across a clearing, a small, eerie glade where the trees thinned, revealing a strange, circular formation of stones. In the center, there was nothing but a dark, empty space. No sounds, no movement, just silence. "Stop here," I urged. Alex parked the car, and for a moment we all sat quietly, looking out at the unnatural stillness of the place. The air felt heavier, colder. A sense of dread settled over us like a heavy shroud. Then we heard it. Whispers. Soft, indistinct murmurs. They seemed to come from the shadows around us, winding through the trees, brushing against the edges of reality. The whispers grew louder, almost mocking, until they were impossible to ignore. "Get out," Sam whispered, his voice trembling. "No," I said, but my voice cracked. The whispers turned into low, guttural chanting. The stones began to hum, vibrating softly beneath our feet. The darkness thickened, consuming the light until all we could see were shadows pressing closer, as though something unseen was gathering around us. "Run!" Emily screamed. We scrambled out of the car, but the forest wasn't empty anymore. Shapes emerged from the shadows, twisted figures, faceless, their forms shifting between glimpses of human and something unnatural. They moved slowly, deliberately, surrounding us. The air grew colder still. I could feel something brushing against my skin, something cold, slimy, unnatural. The chanting was deafening now, a cacophony of whispers and wails. As I looked around, terrified beyond belief, I saw something in the center of the stone circle. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, its body contorted unnaturally. Its eyes were hollow voids and its mouth stretched wide in an endless, wordless scream. In that moment, I knew, whatever this place was, we shouldn't have come. The last thing I heard was the figure's voice, a whisper that echoed in my mind. "You should never have entered the hollow." It was just a normal evening. Cool air, the distant hum of cars on the street. I left the office late, the city lights dimming as I walked down an empty alley toward my apartment. The streets were quiet, eerily so. The usual buzz of nightlife had faded, leaving nothing but silence. As I approached the end of the alley, a figure emerged from the shadows. They stood still, watching me. My heart quickened, but I tried to stay calm. There was something unnatural about their stance. Still too deliberate. They wore a long, dark coat, and the face beneath the hood was hidden in shadow. "Hey," I said cautiously, slowing my pace. "Are you lost?" No answer. The figure took a slow step forward. Another. I started to back away, but my foot hit something. Something sharp in the dirt. I looked down. It was a pocket mirror, cracked and stained with dirt. My breath caught. There was something inside the glass. Something twisted, grotesque, and it wasn't my reflection. Panic surged. Through me, I spun around to run, but the figure was there again, impossibly close. Their voice was a low whisper, distorted, like it came from miles away. You shouldn't have looked. The darkness around us seemed to press in, swallowing the streetlight. Glow. I stumbled, backing toward the alley wall. The figure stepped even closer. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone, but it was dead. Then the air shifted, a chill so cold it felt like a knife to my skin. The sound of whispers filled the alley. Dozens of voices, millions of voices, echoing in unison. My breath came in ragged gasps, my body rigid with fear. The figure raised their hand, and from beneath the hood, a mouthless face emerged. A void, nothing more than darkness. They opened it, and the whispers intensified. I couldn't hear anything else. No traffic, no distant noise, just that suffocating, oppressive silence. "Don't look away," the voice said again. This time it was inside my mind, but I couldn't. My vision blurred, tears streaming down my face as I tried to push forward. The figure, the void, was the only thing I could see, pulling me into the depths of that unholy darkness. And then it all went black. It was a dreary autumn evening when I found myself driving down an isolated country road, the map app on my phone flickering with uncertainty. My friends and I were on a weekend getaway, heading to a supposed abandoned lake house for a bit of adventure. The place was off the grid, miles from any sign of civilization. The closer we got, the more the road twisted through dense, shadowy forests. The sky darkened rapidly, and the air grew cold, biting at our skin through the cracked windows of the old car. The only sound was the distant croaking of frogs echoing through the woods. Finally, we arrived. The lake house sat on the shore, shrouded in mist and overgrown with ivy. It was far more decrepit than we had anticipated. Wooden boards warped, windows shattered, and the entire structure leaning slightly to one side. The front porch sagged under the weight of years of neglect. We stepped inside cautiously. The floors creaked beneath our feet, the silence oppressive. Dust covered everything. Furniture, bookshelves, even the walls seemed to absorb sound. Outside, the lake lapped against the shore with a haunting rhythm. "We should have brought flashlights," Sarah whispered, her voice shaky. Her phone had no signal, and the dim glow of our dying car lights was the only source of illumination. The others were just as uneasy. We spread out, exploring the house. Upstairs, the air grew colder, and shadows seemed to flicker across the walls. Every sound echoed too loudly. A floorboard snapping beneath a footstep, the rustling of curtains in the faint breeze. In the master bedroom, we found an old photo album resting on a cracked nightstand. Its pages were brittle, revealing faded images of a family long gone. As we flipped through the images, an unsettling pattern emerged. Every photo had a figure in the background, always watching. Their faces blurred, but their eyes followed us no matter where we turned. "It's just an old house," Alex said, but his voice trembled. "Nothing to worry about." Yet, we couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The whispers started, faintly at first, soft voices that whispered things too quiet to make out. Then the sounds grew louder, distorted, and malicious. Footsteps padded just out of sight down the hallways, each step measured and deliberate. "We need to leave," Sarah insisted, panic in her eyes. As we gathered in the living room, the front door slammed shut behind us. It didn't creak, it didn't slow. It slammed violently, sending a jolt through our chests. The windows rattled in their frames, and the room seemed to shrink, suffocating. The whispering voices grew louder now, weaving together into a chorus. Words emerged, sentences, without meaning but with an overwhelming sense of menace. Each word sent chills down our spines, like claws scraping against bone. "Get out!" they hissed in unison. Our flashlights flickered and died, plunging us into absolute darkness. The house seemed alive, shifting around us, walls closing in, tighter. We stumbled blindly toward the door, only for it to remain locked. The windows were sealed with layers of fog, blocking any light or view of the outside world. Suddenly, from the darkness, a figure appeared in the room. A tall, shadowy silhouette with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. It moved slowly toward us, its footsteps dragging across the floor like nails on a chalkboard. "Leave us alone," I screamed, though my voice shook violently. But the figure continued, unrelenting, reaching out with elongated fingers. In the final moments, we fell to the floor, shivering as the whispers turned into a deafening roar, an unbearable symphony of terror, and then everything fell silent. It started as a simple renovation project. We were fixing up an old farmhouse we had recently purchased. The house had character, creaky wooden floors, antique fixtures, and a sprawling, overgrown yard. But beneath the charm lay something unsettling. The basement was dark and musty, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and forgotten memories. The wooden stairs creaked as we descended, the sound echoing unnaturally loud. My flashlight barely cut through the oppressive darkness, and the faint hum of the old flickering bulbs above did little to illuminate the space. Boxes lined the walls, some filled with forgotten family heirlooms, others with items that hadn't been touched in decades. The deeper we went, the colder it became, until a shiver ran down my spine. It wasn't the kind of cold you feel when exposed to the elements. It was something more unnatural, something that settled in your bones. Then, in the farthest corner, we found it, a wooden door, unmarked, almost hidden by the layers of dust and cobwebs. The handle was rusted, nearly falling off when I touched it. My curiosity got the better of me. With a hesitant push, the door creaked open. Beyond was a room we hadn't expected, a strange, sterile space that felt disconnected from the rest of the basement. The walls were lined with old medical equipment, iron examination tables, forgotten, syringes, and cabinets filled with jars of specimens preserved in formaldehyde. It looked more like a clinic from another era, abandoned and untouched by time. "That can't be right," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. My flashlight flickered, once more casting unsettling shadows against the walls. The glass containers held twisted, lifeless shapes. A malformed fetus, misshapen limbs, and something that looked far too human. The specimens seemed to pulse ever so slightly, like they were breathing, their glassy eyes reflecting back at us. "Let's get out of here," I urged, but as we turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind us with a deafening bang. The sound reverberated through the basement, trapping us in darkness. Whispers filled the air, soft, guttural voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "Stay," they hissed. "Stay." Fear gripped us, our breaths coming in short, gasps as the air grew colder still. My flashlight was useless now, its beam barely illuminating the faint outlines of the grotesque figures in the jars. The whispers grew louder, morphing into something menacing, a chorus of voices, distorted and pleading. Suddenly, the medical equipment around us began to move. Tables shaking, cabinets sliding open on their own, and the jars tilting as if something unseen was shifting inside them. The specimens writhed, their features twisting into unnatural forms. I could barely scream as I felt something brush against my hand, a cold, bony finger wrapping around mine. In that moment, the voices screamed, inside my head, "You shouldn't have come here." The room dissolved into madness and darkness consumed everything. It was late summer when we stumbled across the old watermill. We had been hiking for hours, deep into the woods, chasing the sound of a distant river. The sun had begun to dip low, casting long shadows across the overgrown trail. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The watermill was a relic of the past. Decaying wooden beams, moss-covered stone walls, and a rusted water wheel that turned sluggishly with no water to power it. Its windows were boarded up, and the roof sagged ominously in places, but there was something oddly captivating about it. We had to take a look. Inside, the air was musty and cool, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat outside. Dust floated in the dim light, disturbed only by our footsteps. It felt as though we had stepped into another time, one that held on to secrets best left buried. The deeper we went, the quieter it became. Our voices seemed to be swallowed by the ancient wood. The room we entered had a broken table at its center, with chairs overturned and papers scattered across the floor. A fireplace at the back was long extinguished, the hearth now home to nothing but ash and cobwebs. "Let's head back," Jenna whispered. Her voice trembled slightly. "Just a little. Farther," I urged, though even I was starting to feel uneasy. The feeling of being watched weighed on me, though there was no one else around. Suddenly, a faint sound echoed, a voice, distant and hollow, coming from the darkness beyond the room. It was soft, barely audible, but it made my skin crawl. I strained my ears to hear more, but only silence returned. "What was that?" I asked, my voice a whisper. "I don't know," James said, his face pale. "Let's leave. Now." As we turned back, the old water wheel gave a slow creak, a sound almost too faint to hear. But it didn't stop. It began to move faster, turning in jerky, unnatural motions, though there was no water to drive it. The eerie noise echoed through, the mill, louder and more distorted, sending shivers down our spines. "Run!" I yelled, and we didn't hesitate. We sprinted toward the entrance, the rusted door creaking behind us, inching shut. The sound of the water wheel increased until it was a deafening hum. Jenna screamed as we reached the exit, the door slamming shut behind us just as we burst out into the clearing. We collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath as the sound of the water wheel slowly faded into the night. The mill was silent once again. We never went back. It was late when we turned off the main highway, the only road leading into the remote, forgotten town. My friends and I had come looking for adventure, seeking out a place rumored to be abandoned for decades. The town was once bustling, full of life, but over the years it had been swallowed by time and nature. The streets were eerily quiet as we parked the car. Shadows loomed over the broken buildings, wooden storefronts crumbling, windows boarded up, and vines crawling over the facades. It was as if the town had been left to rot, forgotten and alone. We stepped out, flashlights cutting through the darkness. Every step we took on the cracked pavement seemed to echo louder than it should. The silence was deafening. "Does anyone else feel off?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't like this," Mark said, glancing nervously at the shadows that seemed to move slightly in the corners of his flashlight beam. The air was cold, almost frigid, and it seemed to tighten around us. Walking down the main street, we saw the remnants of life, a half-rotted bicycle against a storefront, faded signs hanging askew, and doors that creaked open slightly despite being bolted shut. The further we went, the more the feeling of isolation sank in, the sense that we were being watched. Suddenly, a distant sound echoed from somewhere behind us, a low, inhuman hum that seemed to rise out of the darkness. We spun around, but nothing was there. The hum grew louder, more persistent, the closer we got to the center of town. At the center, there was a square surrounded by buildings still mostly intact. However, in the center of the square, a stone statue of a woman stood, tall and beautiful, with her hands raised as though frozen in mid-motion. But something about her was wrong. Her eyes weren't hollow or lifeless, but full, vibrant, as if watching us. That wasn't there before, I stammered, pointing my flashlight at the statue. No way, Mark whispered, stepping back. The hum grew unbearable now, reverberating through the air until it was a deafening, primal roar. We couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as the entire town seemed to shift around us. And then, from the windows, we saw them. Faces, hundreds of them. The windows, those that weren't boarded up, were filled with eyes. Every building was alive, its windows reflecting hollow, grotesque faces peering out at us. A voice echoed from nowhere. "You shouldn't have come." Panic set in. We screamed, struggling to run, but the streets seemed endless, the buildings closing in, the faces following us relentlessly. No matter where we turned, they were there, watching, waiting. The town wasn't abandoned. It was alive, and we were its next victims. It was late afternoon when we arrived at the edge of the forest, a dense, ancient expanse stretching far beyond what we could see. My friends and I were on a camping trip, seeking adventure away from the familiar world. The air was crisp, and the sun pierced through the canopy in sporadic beams. The forest seemed peaceful, but something felt off. We set up our tents near a small clearing, surrounded by towering trees with gnarled branches. The sounds of nature were soothing at first, the distant rustling of leaves, the occasional call of a bird. But as night approached, a strange stillness settled in. The woods were silent, almost too quiet, as though even the animals avoided the area. As we sat around the fire, eating our meals, we began to notice the whispers. At first, it was faint, a distant murmur like the wind brushing through the leaves. But it grew louder, more distinct. Words we couldn't quite make out, voices we couldn't pinpoint. My friends exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. "What is that?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "It's nothing," I said, though my stomach churned with unease. "Just the wind." But the wind didn't explain the chilling way the whispers seemed to form sentences. Phrases like, "You shouldn't have come," and "leave," floated through the air, winding between the trees. They were soft at first, almost imperceptible, but gradually grew louder. We huddled closer to the fire, trying to ignore the eerie sounds. But no matter how loudly we talked or laughed, the whispers never ceased. They followed us, weaving through the branches, becoming louder with every passing minute. Suddenly, one of my friends, Marcus, shouted, "Stop! Stop whispering!" His voice echoed through the still night. The whispers paused, and for a moment, the woods felt utterly silent. But then they came back, closer now, more desperate. They weren't just voices anymore. They were inhuman, guttural, almost like something wrong. I scrambled for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The trees loomed, their twisted shapes casting unnaturally long shadows. The whispers became screams, not of rage or anger, but of despair, a haunting chorus of agony and sorrow that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The fire flickered violently, almost dying out as though being consumed by the darkness. Panic surged through us. Emily screamed, dropping her belongings as we rushed toward the tents. We couldn't run. Our feet seemed rooted to the ground. The whispers intensified into deafening howls, and something slithered through the edges of the light, dark shapes twisting in and out of view. The forest seemed alive. Its branches stretched, its roots pulling at the earth as though reaching for something hidden. I turned back to the clearing, gasping for breath, and saw it, a silhouette, pale and gaunt, standing just beyond the edge of the light. Its eyes were hollow, voids of blackness staring into my soul. "Leave," it hissed, and its voice was not human, not animal, something far worse. It wasn't a sound at all, but a presence, a force so malevolent it tore through the very fabric of reality. A blinding light erupted from my flashlight as I screamed. and in that moment of pure terror, everything vanished. When I awoke, the fire had gone out. My friends were gone. The whispers still echo in my mind. It started as a simple camping trip, a group of friends looking to escape the city for the weekend. We found a remote area deep in the woods, far from civilization. The air was crisp, the trees towering around us, their branches forming a dense canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. It was peaceful at first, but as night fell, something sinister began to stir. Our campsite was set up near the edge of a shallow creek, the sound of running water gently masking any other noise. The fire flickered as we sat around it, telling stories to pass the time. The stars shone bright, but the deeper parts of the woods remained cloaked in shadow. As the hours passed, the stories turned darker. Paranormal encounters, missing hikers, and tales of forgotten rituals. We laughed at first, dismissing them as campfire tales. But the chill in the air grew stronger and the atmosphere shifted. "We're not alone," Jake said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. We all fell silent, listening. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No animals, no distant rustles, just stillness. Even the fire seemed reluctant to crackle. Suddenly, a low, rasping breath broke through the quiet. It came from deeper within the woods, a sound as though something was watching us, close but not visible. My pulse quickened and I turned my gaze toward the shadows beyond the trees. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, barely able to form the words. "We should leave," Olivia said, her voice shaking. "This isn't right." But just as we started packing up, the fire flickered once more and died. Complete darkness consumed the campsite. My flashlight flickered weakly, casting uneven beams into the void. The shadows seemed to move now, shifting subtly against the trees, as though they had taken on a life of their own. "Where's my phone?" Jake asked frantically. "I can't get any signal." No one answered. The silence stretched unbearably, long until we could hear something breathing, quiet, deliberate breaths echoing from the woods. The air grew colder, the ground beneath us softening with damp earth. Something brushed against my leg, cold, slimy. I screamed, stumbling back from the fire pit. "Run!" Olivia yelled. We tore through the trees, crashing through branches, desperate to escape. The sounds of the forest shifted from eerily quiet to chaotic, branches snapping, whispers rising louder, almost mocking us. Then we broke through to the edge of the woods, gasping for air. The moonlight revealed the vast expanse of empty meadow behind us. There was nothing. No sign of the forest, no sign of the darkness that chased us. Only the stars twinkling in the sky. We stood there, trembling, as the realization dawned on us. The woods had disappeared completely. The town had long forgotten about the old toy shop. It sat on the edge of a narrow, winding street, its windows covered in dust, the faded sign barely hanging by a rusted hinge. No one ventured there anymore. The stories had spread long ago. Whispers of toys coming to life in the dead of night, their giggles heard when the shop was empty. But no one believed them. Until now. It was just supposed to be a quick visit. My cousin, Alex, and I had stumbled upon the shop while wandering through the town. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, a mix of old wood and forgotten memories. I pushed open the door. It creaked loudly like a scream echoing through the stillness. Inside, the place was a maze of shelves stacked with toys. Dolls, wooden, soldiers, stuffed animals, all worn and broken in strange ways. The lighting was dim, flickering as if uncertain whether it wanted to work. "This place is creepy," Alex whispered, his voice echoing against the silent walls. "No one's been here for years," I said. "It's just old." We moved cautiously, through the aisles, checking each toy. Many were missing limbs, their expressions contorted into strange, unnerving smiles. One doll had cracked porcelain skin, its hollow eyes staring directly at us. Another, a clown figure, had a red nose that seemed to drip slowly with something dark, possibly paint or something worse. Then we heard the first giggle, a soft, high-pitched laugh echoing through the shop. "Did you hear that?" Alex's voice shook. I nodded, but no words came out. It had sounded close, like it had come from behind us. But when we turned, there was nothing. Only the lifeless toys, their glassy eyes following us in the dim light. "Let's get out of here," I said, my breath quickening. But as we made our way toward the door, it slammed shut behind us. I yelped, spinning around. The shop was darker, now. Too dark. The flickering lights went out completely. We were plunged into absolute silence, save for the soft creaks of wooden shelves settling. Another giggle, louder this time, rose up in the shadows. It seemed to come from everywhere. The toys on the shelves began to move, slightly at first, a doll's arm twitching, a small bear shifting its head. But then they began to move more deliberately. "Stay still," Alex whispered, panic clear, in his voice. The clown doll turned its head fully toward us, its painted grin widening. The wooden soldiers lined up on the shelves shifted into a formation, as though preparing for battle. "We have to get out," I said again, my voice cracking. I fumbled for my flashlight, clicking it on, but it barely illuminated the shop. The shadows moved faster now, darting between the aisles, more giggles rising from unseen corners. "Where's the exit?" Alex shouted, his flashlight flaring briefly before dying. Suddenly, from behind us, the sound of tiny footsteps echoed. I spun around just in time to see the smallest of the dolls, a porcelain boy, its cracked face tilted up toward us, its tiny, chipped lips forming words. "Play with us," it said in a voice so soft it made my skin crawl. "No," I screamed, backing into a shelf. The toys surged forward, dolls clattering off shelves, bears waddling across the floor, and even smaller, shadowy figures emerging from the corners, their twisted faces grimacing with delight. The giggles turned into a chorus, louder and more chilling as they surrounded us. Every direction we turned, there were more of them, living shadows with cracked, lifeless eyes. Then the clown's voice boomed above the others. "Play. Forever." My heart raced as Alex and I pushed against the door, throwing all our weight into it. The giggles grew deafening, filling every inch of the shop. We didn't dare look back. Finally, the door gave way and we stumbled into the street. The shop was still there, still dark, but no movement. The toys remained frozen, lifeless. Once more, we didn't wait to see if they would wake again. Breathing hard, we ran. Down the street, past the empty houses, away from the forgotten toy shop that would haunt our memories forever. We were lucky to escape. But the shop, it still stands. Waiting. Always waiting. The snow fell heavy and fast as we made our way up the winding mountain road. My friends and I had rented a remote cabin deep in the woods, a place untouched by modern life, surrounded by towering pines and endless white. The sun had already set, leaving the landscape bathed in an eerie, blue-tinted glow. As we arrived, the storm intensified. The wind howled through the trees, whipping snow into violent gusts that obscured the path behind us. The cabin stood alone, a weathered wooden structure that creaked with each blast of wind. There was no signal, no power, just silence and isolation. Inside, the fire crackled warmly in the hearth, and we settled in. We laughed, unpacking supplies and sharing stories of the strange legends surrounding the cabin. Locals had warned us to stay alert. Strange things happen in those woods, they said. Of course, we dismissed them as just old tales meant to scare tourists. That night, as the storm raged outside, something woke me. I wasn't sure what it was, maybe the howling wind or the sudden stillness that followed. I sat up, the room dimly lit by the flickering fire. My friends slept soundly, their breathing even and steady. But something wasn't right. A faint tapping echoed through the cabin. Soft, rhythmic, like fingers against a window pane. It wasn't the wind. It came from the front door. I froze. My pulse quickened. The storm outside drowned any sound of movement, but the tapping grew louder, as if whoever, or whatever, was there, was trying to get in. I slowly reached for my phone, hoping for a signal, but it was dead. I could hear nothing but the storm. My breath fogged in the cold air as I stood frozen, listening. The tapping stopped. Silence again, except for the distant creaks of the cabin settling into the storm's embrace. Then, a voice, low and distorted, whispered, "My name." It was close, too close. I backed away from the door, heart racing. My mind screamed to wake the others, but fear kept me rooted. The firelight flickered, casting long, shifting shadows that danced across the walls. The door handle began to turn slowly, not enough to fully open, but enough that I could hear the faint scrape of metal against wood. The voice came again, clearer this time. "Let me in." "No," I whispered back, shaking. I stumbled back to the corner of the room, too terrified to move. Outside, the storm raged on, but the tapping grew frantic. The whispers morphed into quiet, guttural murmurs, murmurs that seemed to come from within the very walls of the cabin. They seemed to echo inside my head, louder with each passing moment. Suddenly, the power flickered on briefly, just for a second, but long enough for me to see. The figure. It stood just beyond the window, half obscured by the falling snow. Its face was hollow. No features, just an inky void where a face should be. But its eyes, they glowed faintly, pale and cold. The scream ripped from my throat as the fire went out, plunging us into darkness once more. I could hear the others stirring, confused, but the figure was already inside, its voice closer now, a sinister whisper in my ear. "You shouldn't have come." It had always been a dream of mine to visit the old lighthouse perched on the edge of the coast. Lonely and secluded, it stood tall against the crashing waves, weathered by time and the elements. No one had lived there for decades, and the stories surrounding it were enough to keep tourists away. Whispers of strange sounds, shadows moving in the corners of windows, and eerie lights flickering from the tower at night. I had heard those stories, but curiosity won out over fear. With nothing but my camera and a notebook, I set out alone to capture the lighthouse. The journey was long and treacherous, the winding coastal roads cutting through cliffs that seemed to scrape the sky. By the time I reached the lighthouse, the sun was sinking below the horizon, leaving the sky in a wash of muted colors. The building loomed over me, massive and imposing. Rusted metal stairs spiraled up the side, disappearing into the top of the tower. I knew there was no electricity, no phone signal, and no one for miles. The isolation was absolute. Still, I was eager to explore. Inside, the air was damp and cool. Old furniture, faded and broken, littered the main room. The walls were lined with photographs and journals, evidence that someone had once called this place home. Dust coated everything, settling like a veil over the long-forgotten memories. Flashlight beam cut through the darkness as I made my way to the staircase. Each step creaked underfoot, the sound echoing down the empty halls. Shadows stretched endlessly in every direction. The higher I climbed, the colder it became, the wind whipping through the open windows. The top of the lighthouse was a narrow room, filled with metal machinery and a glass lens that once guided ships safely through the night. The light had long since died, but the memory of it still hung in the air, a strange, almost tangible presence. I began taking photographs, capturing, the decay, the emptiness. The silence was oppressive, the kind of silence that seems to hum just beyond the ears, a constant, subtle pressure against the senses. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. "Hello?" I called out, my voice a whisper in the vast emptiness. There was no response, just the wind outside, battering the lighthouse like a living thing. But the sensation only grew stronger, as though something was watching me, just beyond the edge of sight. I glanced around, camera ready, but there was nothing. Still, I kept snapping photos. The lens flared once, casting an eerie glow in the dark. Looking through the viewfinder, I saw something, a pale face in the corner of the frame. It wasn't there in reality, only in the photograph. A ghastly figure, eyes hollow and mouth slack, peering out from the shadows. I froze, unable to move. Shaking, I snapped another shot, but the face wasn't there anymore. It was gone, as if it had never existed. I checked the photos in disbelief, but each one was empty, just the desolate interior of the lighthouse. My breath quickened. Suddenly, a voice echoed softly in the distance, carried on the wind. "Stay." I spun around. "Who's there?" Silence. But that voice, so close, so clear, lingered in my mind like a haunting melody. I looked out the windows, scanning the coastline. Nothing but waves crashing against the rocks and the infinite horizon. The hairs on my neck stood on end. I felt exposed, trapped by the vast emptiness. My flashlight flickered again, dying for a moment before flickering back to life. It seemed weaker now, the beam wavering as if struggling against something unseen. I stumbled down the stairs, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere. The lower levels were darker, more enclosed. The wind howled through the windows, but it wasn't enough to drown out the whispers that grew louder with each step. "Leave," the voice whispered again, closer this time. A breath in my ear, I raced toward the door, fumbling with the rusted handle. My flashlight shut off entirely, plunging the lighthouse into complete darkness. Panic surged through me. I heard footsteps, bare, ragged footsteps, on the wooden floor below. They echoed louder and louder, as though whatever was chasing me was right behind me. "Stay with me," the voice said again, this time more insistent, more menacing. With all my strength, I kicked the door open, stumbling into the night. The heaty sea breeze hit me like a wave, cold and bracing, pushing the whispers away. I ran, toward the car, away from the lighthouse. As I sped down the coast, the images flashed through my mind, the face in the photograph, the voice, the footsteps, and I knew. I knew the lighthouse was alive, a place too long abandoned, too tied to something unnatural, something that had never truly left. To this day, I never returned. The lighthouse still stands there, solitary and quiet. But I can't. Forget the shadows that reside within it. Some places I've learned should never be explored. It was supposed to be a weekend camping trip, just my friends and I in the middle of nowhere. No cell service, no crowds, just a quiet patch of forest surrounded by rolling hills. We'd packed enough supplies to last the weekend: tents, sleeping, bags, and plenty of food. But something felt off from the moment we arrived. The forest was dense, with towering trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. As we set up camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Strange noises echoed through the trees, branches snapping, low whispers, and they came from nowhere and everywhere, at once. That night we gathered around the fire telling stories and laughing. But as the fire dimmed, the whispers grew louder. Each sound seemed to brush against the edge of my awareness. A voice in the dark, indistinct and unsettling. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, shivering despite the heat from the fire. "Hear? What?" Sophie replied, her voice uneasy. "Stop being paranoid." But the whispering didn't stop. It was almost as if something was moving through the trees, circling us. The wind howled faintly through the leaves, but it wasn't the wind alone. Shadows danced among the trees, shifting and twisting in ways they shouldn't have been able to. Inside the tent that night, sleep refused to come. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of the tent fabric was amplified 1,000-fold. I kept my flashlight close, shining it around the tent at regular intervals. The darkness outside seemed unnatural, too deep, too still. At some point I heard footsteps, soft, deliberate steps moving around the camp. I sat up abruptly, my heart pounding. My friends were still asleep, unaware. I peeked through the tent's fabric, hoping to catch a glimpse, but there was nothing. Only darkness. The next morning, we packed up in haste. None of us mentioned what had happened during the night, but the tension was palpable. Something about the forest didn't feel right anymore. As we returned along the trail we'd hiked in on, I found my phone miraculously had signal again. I pulled it out to snap a photo of the scenery. When I reviewed the image later, I nearly dropped my phone in shock. In the background of the photo, just barely visible between the trees, was a face, pale, twisted, and watching us. We never camped there again. The carnival had been shut down for years, left to rot beneath the canopy of the forest. Overgrown with weeds and ivy, the once bright attractions were now eerie shadows of their former selves. The Ferris wheel stood still, its skeletal frame rusted and creaking in the wind. The faded colors of the booths were barely distinguishable under the dim light of the setting sun. I wasn't sure why we had decided to visit it, my friends and I, on a dare. The stories of the place being haunted were ridiculous, right? Still, there was an undeniable sense of unease the moment we stepped through the broken entrance gate. The silence was oppressive, interrupted only by the creaking of abandoned machinery. We wandered through the park, stopping at various attractions. The carousel was the most haunting, painted horses frozen mid-gallop, their glass eyes reflecting the emptiness. A carousel music box played faintly, a ghostly melody that seemed out of place in the stillness. "Let's keep moving," I said, my voice hushed. Suddenly, from the shadows beyond the carnival, a figure appeared, a shadowy shape, draped in tattered clothes. Its form seemed to flicker, shifting like a wisp of smoke. We froze, unsure if it was real or just part of the carnival's twisted lore. "Who's there?" I called out, my breath catching. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it moved closer, unnaturally slow, its eyes hollow and empty sockets reflecting. "Nothing." "Run!" Jessica screamed. We sprinted toward the nearest exit, but the carnival seemed endless. Winding paths that doubled back on themselves, funneling us deeper into the nightmare. The Ferris wheel loomed above us, shadows stretching toward the ground as the sky darkened. The figure was still with us, always just within sight, its movements impossible and unsettling. It drifted as if floating, gliding between the empty booths and rides. The screams of an unseen crowd echoed faintly, distant yet terrifyingly close. "We're trapped!" Lucas shouted, his voice cracking. "It's leading us somewhere." "Paardinen, moment." Those words left his mouth. The figure stopped. It raised a skeletal hand, pointing toward an old tent near the center of the carnival. We didn't hesitate. Panic drove us forward. Inside the tent, the air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. Faint whispers filled the space. Hundreds of voices, none of which we could understand. It felt as if the tent itself had consumed us, cutting off our escape. The figure emerged fully, standing before us in full grotesque detail. Its face was nothing but a hollow void, eyes replaced with gaping holes that shimmered faintly with a cold, spectral light. Its laughter was a haunting echo, low and guttural, as if made from nightmares. "We shouldn't have come," the figure hissed, its voice a symphony of tortured whispers. Then the carnival fell silent. It was late when we arrived at the abandoned train station. My friends and I had heard stories, whispered tales about how the station wasn't as empty as it seemed. The building had been closed for years, surrounded by overgrown weeds and broken windows. The local authorities had shut it down after reports of strange happenings, faint voices, flickering lights, and figures that appeared in photographs but couldn't be seen in person. Ryan, Mark, and I decided to explore anyway. We didn't believe in ghosts or curses. We brought flashlights, cameras, and our usual bravado, thinking it would be another uneventful adventure. The inside of the station was eerily quiet. The air was thick with dust, and the faint hum of old wires echoed softly in the empty corridors. We wandered through, taking photos of the decaying platform, the graffiti-covered walls, and the forgotten ticket counters. Nothing seemed unusual, at first, just a place frozen in time. As we continued deeper into the station, we noticed strange things. Mark's camera kept glitching, displaying flickering figures, hazy shadows that drifted through the pictures. At first, we dismissed it as a malfunction, but when Ryan's flashlight suddenly dimmed and then died entirely, we began to feel uneasy. "Okay," I said, forcing a laugh. "Let's call it a night. Nothing here is weird. Yet." But as we made our way back toward the entrance, things started to change. The station seemed quieter, if that was possible. The usual creaks of old wood and metal had stopped. The air grew colder, heavier. We walked past one of the boarded windows, but my flashlight suddenly flickered again. This time, I saw it. A figure, distorted, standing in the distance, just outside the glass. It wasn't moving, just staring. I could barely make out its face. Lips pulled into a grotesque, silent smile. Eyes hollow. "Guys, stop," I whispered, shining my light on the window. But the figure had already disappeared. "Nothing's there," Mark said, though his voice held a trace of doubt. "It's just the darkness playing tricks." We continued on, our unease growing. Then Ryan froze mid-step. His voice trembled as he whispered, "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" I strained to listen, but all I could hear was the faint hum of the station's ancient air conditioning. Mark shook his head. "Nothing but your imagination." Yet, as we turned down a long corridor, there was no mistaking it. A faint whisper, low and desperate, filled the air. It wasn't coming from anywhere we could see. It surrounded us, echoing in every direction. "We need to leave," Ryan said, urgently. Now! The station had become a maze, twisting and turning with no clear way back. Our flashlights flickered again, one by one, until the darkness consumed us. We were left in total blackness. Then, from somewhere nearby, we heard it again. A voice, almost indistinguishable. But this time, it wasn't a whisper. It was laughter. It was closer. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing my friends by the arms. But our feet felt heavier, our breathing labored. The laughter echoed through the walls, louder now, malicious and hollow. As we stumbled into what we thought was an exit, we emerged into a different room, one with photos lining the walls. They were the same photographs we had taken earlier, but these were different. Faces, hundreds of them. People we had never seen before, staring back at us with hollow, lifeless eyes. Some were smiling grotesquely, their mouths open in silent screams. "Get out of here!" Mark screamed, his voice cracking as we tried to back away. But something grabbed my arm, cold, clammy fingers that burned into my skin. I looked down and saw it. A reflection in the shattered glass of one of the photographs. A figure stood behind me, its face just behind mine, closer than it should have been. "No," I gasped. The figure tilted its head, its lips curving into that horrifying smile. It wasn't breathing, it wasn't human. Yet its gaze bore into mine with an unsettling hunger. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. Then the lights flickered, one last time, and the figure vanished. The photographs crumbled into ash, and the darkness around us lifted just enough for us to see the entrance again. We ran. Outside the station, we collapsed in the dirt, gasping for breath. The building stood still behind us, silent once more. But the air was different now. The weight of the station lingered in our chests. We had survived, but something had followed us, and we knew, deep down, that it wasn't truly gone. The amusement park was once the heart of the town. Bright lights, laughter, and the sounds of roller coasters echoing into the night. Now, it was a shell of its former self, an abandoned wasteland of decaying rides and rusted metal. My friends, and I decided to explore it late one evening. The thrill of sneaking into a place that was supposed to be off limits too tempting to resist. The entrance gates were wide open, the rusted hinges creaking as we pushed them aside. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the faint scent of mold clinging to the wooden structures. The silence was eerie, broken only by the distant hum of the city fading into the distance. We wandered through the park, the familiar sights distorted in their abandonment. The carousel stood still, its horses frozen mid-gallop, the painted faces hollow and lifeless. The Ferris wheel, once a towering attraction, now loomed above us, its metal frame leaning dangerously with a low, ominous groan. "There's something off about this place," Emma said, her voice shaking. "It's too quiet." "I know," Jake whispered, looking over his shoulder nervously. "Let's just get out of here." But we couldn't leave yet. The allure of the forgotten amusement park pulled us deeper. We ventured past the decaying snack stands and ghostly game booths, their prize shelves empty and cobwebbed. The further we went, the darker it became, with only the faint glow of dying street lamps to guide us. The more we explored, the more unsettling things became. Every step felt heavier, the air colder. And then we saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the Ferris wheel, its silhouette dark against the fading lights of the city beyond. It was too tall, too thin, its shape twisted unnaturally. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. It didn't move. It just stood there, unmoving, watching. The silence stretched unbearably long. We stared at the figure frozen in place, the weight of the moment pressed down on us, suffocating. Then the figure raised a hand, a long, slender hand, and pointed toward the roller coaster. "No," Jake whispered. "We shouldn't." But something compelled us. The figure was beckoning, its motion slow and deliberate. We couldn't resist. We followed the shadow toward the skeletal remains of the roller coaster. Halfway through the ride, we stopped. Below us was a mess of twisted metal and broken tracks. The train cars had long since rotted away, left hanging eerily in the air. The entire structure groaned in protest, the sound of rust scraping against rust filling the silence. "We need to go back," Emma insisted. "Now!" But as we turned to leave, we heard a voice, a whisper, just behind us. "Why don't you stay?" I spun around. The figure was closer now, no longer just a silhouette. Its twisted form hovered above the ground, its face obscured in shadows. It was the embodiment of wrongness, a distorted, elongated being that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. "Run!" Jake shouted. We bolted, our footsteps pounding against the crumbling pavement. The figure followed effortlessly, its elongated strides covering the distance between us impossibly fast. The ground shook beneath its weight, the shattered rides shaking with each heavy step. We ducked into the ghostly funhouse, desperate to find a hiding spot. Inside, the warped mirrors reflected unsettling images. Faces twisted into screams, bodies shifting grotesquely. Emma let out a scream, her voice piercing the air, but it only seemed to anger whatever was chasing us. The hallways stretched impossibly, the walls closing in. The whispers became screams, louder and louder until we couldn't tell where they were coming from. The distortion of reality was overwhelming, a nightmare given form. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the screams stopped. The funhouse went silent. We crouched in the darkness, too afraid to move. And that's when we heard it, the laughter. soft, high-pitched giggles echoing from somewhere deep within the building. The laughter grew louder, echoing off the warped walls. It was coming closer. "Wake up!" Jake whispered frantically, shaking me. "It's a nightmare. Wake up!" But it wasn't a nightmare. It was real, and it wasn't letting us go. The museum was old, centuries old, abandoned for years. The city forgot about it, lost beneath modern developments, hidden from view. My friend Jacob and I stumbled upon it by chance. A broken gate, the remains of a crumbling facade. Intrigued, we decided to explore, fueled by the thrill of something forgotten. Inside, the air was thick, stale with the scent of rotten dust. Dim, flickering lights guided our way through the long halls lined with forgotten artifacts. Statues, paintings, and ancient relics were scattered throughout, but something about the place felt off. It wasn't just the dust or the mold, it was the silence, the oppressive stillness. The only sounds were the echoes of our footsteps, amplified by the empty corridors. Jacob whispered, "This feels wrong." I nodded, but my voice caught in my throat. It was more than wrong. It was unnatural. In the farthest hall, we stumbled upon a room, its door ajar. Inside, the walls were lined with mirrors. Not simple mirrors, though. These were cracked, distorted reflections of the museum itself, twisted, warped beyond recognition. Some showed glimpses of other places entirely, places we couldn't comprehend. We moved cautiously, avoiding the mirrors as though they were alive. In the center of the room sat a pedestal, empty save for a single object, a black, weathered book. It was ancient, covered in symbols we couldn't read. Every time we moved closer, an eerie chill seemed to settle over us, sapping the warmth from the air. Jacob ran his fingers over the symbols. This isn't normal." "No," I whispered. "We should leave." But something kept us, rooted in place. I felt the weight of the room pressing down on me, the oppressive silence turning into something almost alive. The mirrors flickered, and for a moment, I saw something in the reflection, a figure standing behind us. The room itself seemed to pulse with energy, as though it was feeding on our presence. "Run," I managed to say, but my voice was hoarse. Jacob tried to pull me away, but the book trembled on its pedestal, and suddenly, the mirrors shattered, in unison, sharp, piercing cracks that echoed through the room. I stumbled back, covering my ears, but it was as though the sound went straight through me. In the fragments of the mirrors, I saw them. Faces, dozens of them. Distorted, screaming faces that didn't belong to the past or the present. They filled the glass, mouths open in silent torment, their eyes hollow and empty. Jacob fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the sheer terror. "They're here," he gasped. "They're watching." Suddenly, the mirrors moved. Not physically, but they seemed alive, shifting slowly, always reflecting something new. Faces began to press through the glass, hands reaching out, clawing. For us. The air grew colder. I could feel the icy touch of fingers brushing against my skin. The book began to chant. Low, guttural whispers in an ancient language. The words twisted in the air, wrapping around us like a noose. I couldn't tell where they were coming from. The mirrors, the book, or something unseen. But the effect was immediate. My vision blurred, and I felt as if the world itself was folding inward. "Leave," I cried, but my voice was drowned by the chanting, and then there was nothing but darkness. It started when my grandmother passed away. We inherited her house, a small, charming place tucked away on the edge of a forgotten town, remote, isolated, and untouched by modern life. It was the perfect spot for a quiet retreat, far from the chaos of the city. The house itself was old, built in the late 1800s, surrounded by overgrown gardens and trees that seemed to tower above the house. Everything about it felt frozen in time, almost as though it had been untouched for decades. When we arrived, there was an unsettling silence. The town itself seemed abandoned. No signs of life, no movement, as if the world had simply forgotten it. The streets were lined with empty shops, broken windows, and faded, peeling signs. The only sound was the wind whispering through the broken streets. The house was no different. From the moment we stepped inside, we could feel it. A heavy, oppressive feeling, like something had taken root here and refused to let go. The air was thick, stagnant, and there was an eerie sense of being watched. The furniture was covered. In white sheets, the rooms filled with the smell of dust and decay. We tried to shake off the feeling, telling ourselves it was just the weight of the past. But the feeling only grew stronger as the days passed. Shadows seemed to flicker at the edges of our vision. Doors creaked open on their own, and the air felt colder in certain rooms, even with the windows shut. One night, as I lay awake, unable to sleep, I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, not coming from any direction but from inside the house itself. It wasn't something I could pinpoint, just a faint, low murmur, like someone standing just behind me, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. At first, I convinced myself it was my imagination. But then I heard it again, louder this time, almost as though it was speaking my name. I sat up, my heart pounding, but there was no one there. The whisper faded away as quickly as it had come. The next morning, I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the old house settling, or perhaps the remnants of my dreams. But as the days went on, the whispers became more persistent. They didn't always come in words, but in sounds, muttering, almost like a distant conversation I couldn't quite grasp. And there were other things, shadows that seemed to watch me from the corners of rooms, figures that would appear in the corner of my vision and vanish the moment I turned to face them. One evening, I was sitting by the window, staring out at the empty town. The sun had just set, casting long shadows across the streets. I saw a figure standing there, motionless. Its silhouette was distorted, almost unnatural, like a hollow mask where a face should be. It wasn't watching me. It was watching the house. Panic gripped me, but I couldn't look away. It didn't move, didn't shift. It was as though it was waiting for something. Or someone. That night, I decided to confront whatever was haunting us. I couldn't take the whispers anymore, the feeling of being watched. Grabbing a flashlight, I explored the house from top to bottom, my pulse quickening with each creak of the wooden floorboards. Nothing prepared me for what I found in the basement. The air down there was colder than anywhere else in the house. The flickering flashlight revealed old shelves, long empty bottles of something that had long since evaporated. But then I saw it, something that stopped me in my tracks. A figure stood at the far end of the basement. It was different from the others. Taller, darker, more solid, but still hollow, as if only half of it existed. Its head tilted as I approached, but it made no sound, no movement. Just stood there, waiting. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice cracking. It didn't answer, but the whispers grew louder in my head. Words this time, impossible to ignore. "Get out," they said, over and over. "Leave this place." Terror surged through me. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the old cobblestones. My breath came, in shallow gasps, and I didn't look back. When I made it back upstairs, the house felt different. The oppressive weight was gone, but so was that sense of safety. The whispers had stopped, but I knew they weren't truly gone. They were buried, waiting for the next time they'd rise. We haven't stayed long since that night. The house is still there, just as it was, untouched. And though we've moved on, I still wonder if it waits, patient and silent, as if waiting for us to return and finish what we started. The whispers, the shadows, they're still there, always, watching, always lurking, and sometimes I swear I hear them again, even now, in the quiet of the night. It was a rare invitation, one that didn't come often. An old friend's beach house, far from the busy city, offered to us for the weekend. The house was tucked away along the edge of a cliff, overlooking the vast, endless ocean. There were no neighbors, no nearby towns, just the house and the sea. We were the only ones for miles. At first glance, the house seemed idyllic. Whitewashed walls, weathered wooden beams, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the crashing waves below. It was a place made for quiet escapes, the kind of serenity that draws you in. But something felt off. The ocean was beautiful, sure, but there was an unnatural stillness to it. No seagulls, no crashing waves, just a quiet, eerie roar that seemed to echo endlessly. We chalked it up to being far from any usual signs of life, but that gnawing feeling didn't leave. On the first night, things began to shift. We sat by the fire, the sound of the ocean roaring below like a constant reminder that we were isolated. At first, it was subtle, the sound of footsteps on the deck, soft, almost imperceptible. We ignored it, assuming the wind was playing tricks on us, but the wind never sounded like that. "Just the house settling," Ryan said. Emma and I nodded in agreement, but there was an edge to his voice, a flicker of doubt we couldn't ignore. By the second night, the footsteps grew louder, more distinct. We couldn't ignore them anymore. They were slow, deliberate, circling the house like something was inspecting us. When we would rush to the windows, the deck below was empty. Nothing but the waves crashing far below. "Could be an animal," Emma suggested. But animals don't walk in that way. Calm and measured. Whatever it wasn't outside. That's when the whispers began. Soft at first, as if they were carried in on the wind, but as the night wore on, they became clearer. Not just whispering, but a voice. A deep, hollow voice that seemed to echo inside my head. "Go away." I looked around the room, but neither Ryan nor Emma had heard it, or at least they wouldn't admit to it. "It's nothing," Ryan said again, his voice uneasy. "Just the ocean." But it wasn't. The voice came back, clearer this time, stronger. "Leave." I could feel it in my bones. Something was in the house with us. Something that didn't want us there. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper that came from nowhere, kept us awake. It felt like the house itself was alive, watching us, waiting for the right moment. At dawn, I woke to a cold, oppressive silence. The kind of silence that makes you hold your breath, waiting for something to break it. I wandered to the windows, hoping for a glimpse of the ocean, but instead my eyes fell on something far worse. Standing just beyond the window, I saw a figure, tall, shadowy, its shape distorted by the mist in the morning fog. It didn't move, didn't blink, didn't seem to breathe. It just stared, its hollow eyes locked on me. I couldn't scream. I couldn't look away. It felt like time had stopped. Then, slowly, it raised one hand and waved, just once. I didn't wait for it to do anything else. I bolted from the room, heart racing, finding Ryan and Emma in the living room, staring at the same window. "It's here," I gasped. "It's still here." Their eyes were wide, but neither of them spoke. We didn't need to. We all knew what we had seen. The whispers came again, louder now. This time, we couldn't ignore them. "Leave now." Panic set in. We grabbed our things, not daring to stay another moment. The house felt alive, like it was holding us there against our will. As we stepped outside, the figure was gone. The ocean roared louder than ever, as if it too had been waiting for us to leave. We've never been back to that house. The whispers still haunt me, and sometimes when I'm by the sea, I can still feel the weight of that stare. Whatever was there, it's still waiting. It was a quiet, ordinary evening when we decided to explore the old tunnel beneath the city. The tunnel wasn't exactly hidden, but it wasn't well known either, just a place some kids had talked about exploring years ago. My friends and I, curious and bored, thought it might make for an interesting adventure. None of us expected what we would find. The entrance was hidden under a narrow bridge, overgrown with weeds, covered in graffiti. It smelled of damp earth and decay. As we walked down, flashlights cutting through the darkness, the air grew colder and the walls seemed to press in around us. The tunnel stretched ahead, endless, lit only by the faint glow of our headlights. First, everything felt normal. The tunnel echoed with the sound of our footsteps and the strange whispers of the wind. But the deeper we went, the more the feeling of unease settled over us. My friends joked, trying to lighten the mood, but I could tell we were all on edge. There was something oppressive about the tunnel, as if it had been waiting for us. Then we heard it. Faint, distant at first, like a whisper. "Help! Help!" We exchanged uneasy glances. The voice wasn't loud enough to make sense of, but it seemed to resonate through the tunnel like a ghostly echo. I knew then that we were no longer alone. One of my friends, Sam, called out hesitantly. "Hello? Is someone down there?" The response came again, louder this time. "Help! Help! Please!" This time it was clearer, as if someone was begging us from the darkness. We hesitated, unsure whether to respond or run, but something about the desperation in that voice kept us rooted in place. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaky. The silence that followed was worse than any response. We listened to the sound of our own breathing, the faint drip of water from the ceiling. Then, another sound, soft, dragging, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. "Please." "Help! I'm trapped," the voice called again, but this time it was closer. We didn't move. The flashlight beams swept the shadows, searching for the source of the voice, but there was nothing to be seen. The tunnel stretched endlessly, the darkness swallowing the light. Suddenly, something shifted. A figure emerged from the blackness. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. The shape was twisted, elongated, its limbs jerking unnaturally as it moved toward us. Its face was obscured by shadows, but I could see its eyes, empty and hollow, like voids in the darkness. "Help!" the figure rasped, its voice distorted, as though speaking from a place far beyond our world. We backed away, panic surging through us. The tunnel seemed to stretch further, the walls closing in around us. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human, and it wasn't something we could fight. Without thinking, we turned and ran. The tunnel echoed with our footsteps, the strange cries of the figure fading behind us. I didn't stop until we burst out into the cold night air, gasping and trembling. None of us looked back. To this day, I don't know what we saw. The tunnel remains beneath the city, hidden, waiting. I've tried to convince myself it was a dream, a trick of the light, but I know better. Something is down there, something that shouldn't be disturbed. I still hear the voice sometimes, calling from the dark, and I know I'll never forget it. It started as a simple trip to the old lighthouse, a place my family had visited countless times. We used to come here to watch the sunset, the ocean waves crashing against the cliffs below, the lighthouse casting its beam out over the water. This time, we decided to stay overnight, hoping for a quiet escape from the routine of life. The lighthouse stood tall and solitary at the edge of the rocky cliffs, its paint peeling and windows grimy from years of neglect. It wasn't operational anymore, but the view from the top was still breathtaking. Vast stretches of sea, endless skies, and the horizon meeting the horizon, uninterrupted. We set up our small tent a little ways down from the lighthouse, out of view from the old structure, and settled in for the evening. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the cliffs. As the sky darkened, the air became colder, the saltwater breeze sharp against my face. The sounds of the ocean became louder, more rhythmic, as if the waves themselves were trying to communicate. That's when things started to feel off. The usual quiet of the night was disrupted by strange, faint whispers carried on the wind. I shrugged it off at first, convincing myself it was just the wind playing tricks. But the whispers weren't constant. They came and went, drifting in and out like ghostly echoes. I looked around, but there was no one else in sight. My family was asleep in the tent, oblivious. Then I noticed something peculiar. The lighthouse, standing dark and foreboding, had always felt like a landmark, a safe beacon of light in the darkness. But now it felt different. It wasn't just that it was no longer operational. It felt like it had a presence of its own. I felt watched. I decided to climb up to the lighthouse, telling myself it was probably just my imagination. The inside of the structure was cold and damp, the smell of aged wood and salt overwhelming. Dust particles danced in the faint moonlight that filtered through the grimy windows. I took the stairs to the top, my footsteps echoing eerily in the empty space. At the top of the lighthouse, I stood in awe of the view. But as I looked out across the horizon, something caught my eye. A figure standing at the edge of the cliff, far below. It was too far for me to make out any details, but it stood motionless, like a statue. I squinted, trying to focus, but the figure didn't move. My heart pounded. I called out, but there was no response. The wind carried my voice away. I wanted to go back down, but something held me there. The figure remained, staring, unmoving. I turned to leave when I heard a sound, the soft creak of footsteps on the stairs behind me. My blood ran cold. I was alone. There was no reason for anyone else to be there. I spun around, expecting to see nothing, but there it was. A figure at the top of the stairs, eerily still, its face obscured by the shadows. My breath caught, and I backed away slowly, my legs trembling. As I descended the stairs, I could feel the figure following, its presence closer now as if it were breathing down my neck. When I reached the bottom, I bolted toward the tent, heart racing, the whispers now louder, more insistent. I didn't sleep that night. The whispers didn't stop. In the morning, when my family woke, there was no sign of the figure, just the sound of the ocean and the wind. But the feeling remained, the feeling that we weren't alone, that whatever had watched me from the cliff was still out there, waiting. It was a quiet evening, and I had decided to go for a walk in the old neighborhood park that bordered the edge of town. The park wasn't particularly large, but it had always felt familiar, almost like a second home growing up. The trees were tall and ancient, their twisted branches stretching across the paths, casting long shadows as the sun dipped below the horizon. It had been years since I last wandered through these trails, but I always felt drawn back whenever I needed space to think. As I walked deeper into the park, the air grew cooler, the rustling leaves crunching softly beneath my feet. There were hardly any other people around, which only added to the sense of solitude. I wasn't expecting to encounter anyone. The park was rarely crowded during the evening hours. I figured it would be a peaceful walk, perfect to clear my head after a long day. I passed a small, decrepit wooden bench half buried beneath overgrown vines. It was an old fixture from the days of my childhood. I paused for a moment, staring at the faded graffiti that had long since been swallowed by moss. The bench felt like a quiet witness to countless secrets from the past, memories of old friendships and whispered promises. As I continued along the trail, I noticed the faint sound of running water. A small creek weaved its way through the park, barely noticeable until now. The gentle babble of the stream was oddly calming, and I decided to follow its course. The path led me to a clearing, where the creek widened into a shallow pool surrounded by tall, leafy trees. The sunset painted the water in hues of amber and gold, reflecting the serene beauty of the surroundings. I sat down by the edge, my feet dipping into the cool, clear water. The sound of the water lapping against the rocks was soothing. I lost track of time, simply sitting there, letting my thoughts wander. The tension from earlier in the day seemed to melt away, replaced by an eerie stillness. There was no breeze, no rustling of leaves, just an unnatural silence that seemed almost too quiet. Suddenly, from deep within the trees, I heard a whisper. It was faint at first, almost like the wind shifting through the leaves. But as I strained to listen, the whispers became clearer, more distinct. "I'm here." The words were barely more than a breath, carried by the faint breeze. My heart jolted. I glanced around, expecting to see someone emerging from the trees, but the clearing remained empty. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks. The park was known for its stillness, for its isolated atmosphere. Maybe it was just the wind, bending the branches and creating phantom sounds. Still, the voice echoed in my head. "I'm here. Please, stay." My pulse quickened and I stood up, backing away from the water's edge. The feeling of being watched returned, pressing down on me like a weight. I could feel something. Something was there, hidden just beyond the trees. I turned and began walking quickly toward the trail. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, like they were moving closer. Each step I took sent chills down my spine. Then, just as I reached the edge of the trees, I felt it. A cold, bony hand grasping at my arm. I froze, unable to move, my breath hitching in my throat. I could feel the cold of its touch, something impossibly dry and lifeless. "I told you." "Stay," the voice whispered again, right next to my ear this time. The air seemed to vibrate around me, thick and suffocating. Tears stung my eyes as I fought the rising panic. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to respond. The grip tightened, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "Don't leave," the voice continued, quieter this time, almost desperate. "You can't." Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the grip released. I staggered back, my heart pounding, and ran as fast as I could toward the distant glow of the city. I haven't been back to that park since. And every night when I close my eyes, I still hear the whispers, soft and haunting, reminding me that whatever was there is still waiting. It was a bright, crisp afternoon when I decided to go for a hike. I'm not someone who ventures into nature often, but something about that day felt inviting. My backpack was light, just water, some snacks, and a map. I drove out of town, past the familiar roads, until the last hints of civilization faded behind me. The trailhead was quiet, empty, except for a small wooden sign that read, "Welcome to Bear Creek." The trail was peaceful at first, winding through thick forests of towering pines. The sound of my footsteps on the soft dirt path was the only noise I could hear. I checked my map occasionally, noting the twists and turns, but the trail wasn't complicated. I'd done plenty of hikes before, so I wasn't too concerned. A few miles in, the trees started to thin, and the landscape opened up to a grassy clearing. It was breathtaking. Mountains on the horizon, the sky a deep blue, the only sound being the rustling of leaves in the wind. I sat down for a moment, taking it all in. That's when I noticed something strange. At first, I couldn't tell what it was. A faint glimmer of something silver far off in the distance, just beyond the tree line. I rubbed my eyes, wondering if I was imagining it. But as I watched, the silver shimmer became clearer. It wasn't moving, just sitting there, reflecting the sunlight. Curiosity got the better of me. I stood up and began walking toward it, keeping the map in my hand. The ground became uneven, the trees thick once again, but the shimmer stayed in my view. It was almost as if it were calling to me, like a lure in the distance. My footsteps quickened. When I finally reached the spot, my breath caught. It wasn't just a glint of sunlight reflecting off rocks. It was an old, weathered metal object half buried in the dirt. I knelt down, brushing away some leaves and soil. It was a canister, small, rusted, and seemingly forgotten. Curious, I opened it. Inside was a thin roll of yellowed paper, folded over and tightly sealed with wax. My fingers trembled as I pulled it out. The paper smelled faintly of mildew, but it was legible. The handwriting was uneven, shaky. It read, "Help. Please, someone find me. It's in the woods. Don't follow the trail too far. I'm hiding." My heart raced. I looked around, scanning the trees. Was someone lost? Who had left this? The silence around me felt suddenly oppressive. The woods seemed to close in. I debated for a moment, torn between leaving or trying to find the person who wrote it. Before I could decide, I heard a noise behind me, soft and distant. I froze, every muscle in my body tightening. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate. I couldn't see anyone, but they were there, approaching quietly. I grabbed my map, my hands shaking, and turned to head back. But as I took a step, the footsteps stopped. Silence again. I glanced back, but there was nothing. Just the trees, the rustling leaves, and the feeling that I was being watched. I pressed on, heart pounding, but the sense of unease only grew. The trail felt longer on the way back, each step more cautious than the last. Every noise made me jump, rustling branches, distant whispers in the wind. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone behind me, but there was never anyone there. When I finally made it back to my car, I didn't stop to look back. The canister still sat in my backpack, unopened. I've never gone back to that trail. Whatever left that message, whatever was watching me in those woods, I hope I never have to face it again. It started as an ordinary evening. I was driving home after spending the day clearing out my grandmother's old attic. The house had been untouched for decades, filled with boxes of forgotten memories. It had been a long, dusty day, and now I was finally heading back. The sun had set hours ago, and the country roads were quiet, stretching endlessly into the darkness. The radio had been static for the past few miles. I didn't mind. The road ahead was barely lit by the faint glow of my headlights, casting long shadows that danced across the trees lining the sides of the road. It was peaceful, except for the growing unease that had been settling in my chest since I left the house. About halfway home, the road curved sharply, and ahead, I noticed something unusual. A figure stood at the edge of the road. I slowed the car, my stomach tightening. It was a woman, I could tell even from a distance. She wore a long, flowing dress that billowed slightly in the wind. She was staring directly at my car, unmoving. I slowed to a crawl, unsure what to do. As I passed her, my heart pounded harder. I glanced at her through the rear-view mirror. She was still standing there, motionless, as if frozen in place. I didn't know why, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. A few minutes later, I heard it. A faint knocking sound, soft but persistent. It came from the back of my car, barely loud enough to hear over the hum of the engine. I slowed even further, my hands tightening on the steering wheel. I kept glancing into the mirror but saw nothing but the empty stretch of road behind me. The knocking continued, growing louder now, more urgent. I didn't dare stop. My mind raced. Was it just my imagination? Some kind of mechanical noise? But it didn't sound mechanical. It was too deliberate. And then, just as I was about to pull over, the knocking stopped. For a long stretch, there was silence. The kind of silence that feels oppressive, as if the world itself is holding its breath. I gripped the wheel tighter, eyes glued to the road ahead, waiting for something. Anything. It wasn't until I neared the edge of town that I saw her again. The woman from before, standing by the side of the road. This time, she was closer, and in the moonlight I could see her face. Her eyes were hollow, black holes staring directly at me. My breath caught in my throat as I realized she wasn't just standing there. She was walking. But it wasn't the slow, deliberate steps of a living person. It was as if she was drifting, gliding with unnatural ease. I tried to tell myself it was just some wandering spirit, a hallucination maybe. But the fear clawing at my chest was real. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel tighter. As I passed her, I braced myself for the sound of her voice, but it never came. I didn't look back. I couldn't. When I finally reached my house, I was shaking. I locked the door behind me and didn't bother looking back. I didn't go out the next night, or the one after that. And I've never seen that woman again. But some nights, I swear I can still hear the faint sound of knocking. I don't remember exactly when I noticed something strange. It wasn't a specific moment, more like a slow, creeping feeling that followed me for days. I was spending a week at my family's lake house, a place we've always gone to relax. Nothing special, just a quiet cabin on the edge of a still lake surrounded by forest. The first few days were peaceful, just me and my parents. We spent our time fishing, hiking, and reading. The lake was calm and the forest stretched endlessly around us. I figured it was just one of those perfect summer trips where nothing goes wrong. But then the dreams started. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, soaked in sweat, my heart pounding. The dreams weren't anything like the usual ones. No monsters, no shadows lurking in the dark. It was more like silence. A deep, oppressive silence that felt too heavy to breathe in. The forest, the lake, it was all too quiet. I could hear my own breathing and nothing else. No crickets, no rustling leaves, no waves lapping at the shore. Just a complete void of sound. The third night, it happened again. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the quiet surroundings messing with my head. I got out of bed and stepped onto the small porch, hoping a breath of fresh air would clear my mind. But as soon as I stepped outside, I felt it. Something wasn't right. The lake, usually serene and reflective, had become unsettlingly still. I sat down on the porch, staring at the water, listening to the echo of my thoughts. Then I noticed something. The surface of the lake wasn't calm anymore. It had started to ripple. Not from any wind, but from something beneath it. At first, I thought maybe it was just a fish or some animal moving through the water, but the ripples weren't natural. They formed a pattern, slow and deliberate. A figure, faint and shadowy, began to emerge beneath the surface. I froze. The figure didn't resemble a person. It was long, distorted, its limbs unnaturally elongated, moving like it was struggling to pull itself from the depths. Its eyes, if they could even be called that, were hollow and dark, like the void beneath the water. I couldn't look away. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. The figure seemed to glide toward me, its movements unnatural, like something from a dream, too wrong to be real. I could feel its gaze, even though it had no visible face. I couldn't comprehend what I was seeing, but I knew it wasn't something human. Then it vanished. The water grew calm again. I blinked, not sure if what I had seen was real. The air felt heavy, and I sat there for what felt like hours, too afraid to move. Eventually, I forced myself back inside, locking every door and window. The next morning, my parents woke me up as if nothing had happened. The sun was shining, and everything seemed normal. We went about our day, fishing, laughing, trying to forget about the quiet nights. But I knew deep down that something had changed. It's been years since that trip, but I still visit the lake house. The dreams haven't stopped, and sometimes in the stillness of the night, I wonder if I'll see that figure again, waiting beneath the surface, watching. It started on a warm summer evening. I decided to take a long walk through a park near my apartment. It wasn't particularly special, just one of those city parks with paved paths, trees, and a small pond that people like to visit on weekends. I wasn't expecting much, just some fresh air and a bit of peace. As I walked, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows from the trees. The place was mostly deserted, save for a few scattered families and couples enjoying the cool evening. I passed a group of kids playing near the pond, their laughter echoing off the water. It was peaceful, almost serene, and I welcomed the quiet. I hadn't wandered far when I noticed something strange. A bench further along the path was occupied by a figure sitting completely still. At first, I thought nothing of it. Maybe someone deep in thought, taking a moment to rest. But as I got closer, I saw that there was no movement, no indication that they were alive. I stopped a few paces away, studying them from a distance. The figure was slouched forward, their head bowed as if lost in thought. But something wasn't right. Their posture wasn't relaxed. It was unnatural. They sat there, motionless, not responding to the world around them. Even the gentle evening breeze seemed to avoid disturbing them. I stood there, unsure whether to approach. Something felt off, like they were not supposed to be there. Slowly, I took a step closer, my breath coming a little quicker. The closer I got, the more I realized that the figure wasn't breathing. I froze. My mind raced as I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe they were asleep, but how could they sit like that, so completely still? I glanced around, trying to gather my thoughts. There were no signs of life anywhere nearby. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as though I had stepped into a world that wasn't meant for me. My instinct was to leave, but something held me there, rooted to the spot. A quiet voice in my head told me to stay, that I couldn't just walk away from this. I stepped closer, my breath shallow as I tried to make out any detail, anything that could tell me they were alive. That's when I saw it. The face, pale, void of any expression. It wasn't the stillness that terrified me most, but the eyes. They were open, but they didn't reflect light, didn't seem to see. There was no life behind them, only emptiness. I took another hesitant step forward, my heart pounding harder now. The figure didn't move. I reached out slowly, trembling fingers brushing against the arm. It was cold, unnaturally cold, like they had been there for ages. Terror surged through me, but before I could turn and run, a faint whisper reached my ears, barely audible above the silence. It was a voice, hollow and distant. "Don't leave." I spun around, but there was no one there. The park was still empty, the fading light of the sun casting long shadows. I looked back at the figure whose gaze seemed to follow me as I backed away. With every step, I felt as though something was pulling at me, drawing me closer again. I forced myself to turn and run, my legs carrying me away from the figure, from the park, from whatever had been watching me. When I finally stopped to catch my breath, the park was silent again. No sign of the figure, no echo of the voice, only the fading hum of the city in the distance. I didn't go back to that park, and to this day I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't supposed to leave. It was a quiet evening when my friends and I decided to take a drive out into the hills. We weren't exactly sure where we were going, but that was part of the appeal. Just aimlessly exploring, watching the sunset over the valley, letting the world slip away. The winding road stretched ahead, surrounded by thick woods on either side. We were laughing, joking about nothing in particular, when we came across a narrow dirt path that cut off from the main road. It wasn't marked, barely noticeable, but curiosity got the best of us. "Let's see where it goes," one of my friends said, turning onto the path. The trees grew thicker as we followed the trail, the sun dipping lower on the horizon. The deeper we drove, the quieter it became. The only sound the crunching of gravel beneath the tires. The woods seemed to close in around us, shadows creeping longer as the light faded. After what felt like miles, we came across an old, decrepit cabin. Its roof sagged, windows shattered, and the door hung ajar like something had long since abandoned it. The sight of it sent a chill down my spine. We stopped the car and got out, drawn by some strange compulsion. The air was still, heavy with the scent of decay. The cabin stood there, a relic from a forgotten past, like it had been waiting for us to find it. The three of us hesitated, but something about the silence and the sense of isolation pulled us closer. Inside, it was colder than outside. Dust covered everything, and the faint smell of mildew hung in the air. Old furniture lay overturned, forgotten and broken. It was as though no one had been here in decades. My friends and I moved cautiously, shining our flashlights into the corners of the cabin, peering through the debris. Then we heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, like someone dragging their feet across the floorboards. It wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the cabin, We froze, our breath catching in our throats. The cabin was small, too small for someone to be hiding. We had checked the whole place, every room, yet those footsteps kept moving, circling us, echoing louder as they drew closer. Panic set in. My friends were shouting, trying to make sense of it, but I was rooted to the spot. The light from my flashlight flickered, casting shadows that seemed to twist and bend unnaturally. Then I saw it. A figure standing in the doorway. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its face was obscured by darkness. No eyes, no features, just a void where the face should have been. It moved closer, the footsteps still echoing, but now they were slower, more deliberate. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The thing didn't seem to notice us, as if we were invisible. It reached out, its long, bony fingers brushing against the doorframe, and then it simply disappeared. We didn't stay. We couldn't. My friends and I ran back to the car, not looking back, the silence of the woods pressing down on us as we tore down the path. The strange figure, whatever it was, had vanished. But the fear it left behind lingered, hanging in the air like a bad dream. Even now, I can't forget the stillness of the woods, the hollow echo of those footsteps, and the figure that no one could explain. Some things don't need answers to be terrifying. I had always loved the quiet of late-night drives, the stillness of the road, the moonlight illuminating the empty stretch ahead. It was the perfect time to think, to be alone with your thoughts. So, one evening, after a long day of work, I decided to take a drive through the countryside. The roads were winding and dark, but the drive itself was soothing. I didn't have a destination in mind, just wanted to escape the noise of the city and clear my head. The air felt crisp, and I rolled down the windows, letting the cool breeze rush in. As I drove further into the night, the world around me seemed to shrink. The only sounds were the hum of my tires on the asphalt and the occasional rustling of trees that loomed on either side of the road. I didn't pass another car for miles. It was peaceful in a way that was almost surreal. About an hour into the drive, I noticed something strange, a figure standing by the side of the road. At first, I assumed it was a hitchhiker, but something about the way they stood, unmoving, just watching the road, felt off. They didn't seem to be waiting for a car. They were just there, staring. I slowed down, unsure of what to make of it. As I got closer, I realized the figure wasn't human. It was tall, unnaturally so, with long limbs that bent in ways they shouldn't. Its face was obscured, hidden beneath a dark hood, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. My heart pounded as I drove past, trying to keep my eyes on the road. I didn't dare look back, but I just knew. It was watching me. The rest of the drive was consumed by a growing sense of dread. The peaceful night had become something else entirely. Every creak of the car, every shadow cast by the moon, felt like they were part of something larger. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was overtired and spooked. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I reached a small town as dawn began to break. The figure was gone, but I couldn't forget the sense of being watched. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the car keys, trying to calm my racing thoughts. That's when I noticed something strange. My rearview mirror was cracked, as if something had grabbed it. I haven't driven that road since. My friends and I had been planning a hiking trip for weeks, a chance to escape the city and immerse ourselves in the quiet, untouched beauty of the mountains. We were tired of screens and the constant noise of everyday life. This would be our chance to disconnect and recharge. The trailhead was only about an hour's drive from town, and we arrived just as the sun was beginning to set. The air was crisp, and the towering pines stretched endlessly in every direction. The trail was well worn, though not overly crowded. It was perfect. As we started the hike, the conversations flowed, and we basked in the sounds of nature, the crunch of gravel beneath our feet, the soft rustling of leaves, and the distant call of birds. We decided to set up camp a few miles in, beside a stream that meandered through the forest. The spot felt isolated and peaceful, exactly what we were looking for. As we set up our tents and built a fire, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the ground. That's when it started. At first, it was subtle, a faint rustling in the underbrush. I figured it was just some wildlife, maybe a deer or a squirrel. But as the evening deepened, the sounds grew more distinct. It wasn't just the rustling anymore. There were footsteps, quiet at first, but steady, following us. I stopped and turned around, expecting to see one of my friends, but no one was there. The woods were still except for the distant hum of insects. I didn't say anything to the others. I didn't want to worry them, but my nerves were already fraying. Every step we took, I felt like we were being watched. The sounds of the forest, which had been so comforting earlier, now felt oppressive. It wasn't just wildlife out there anymore. By the time we made it to camp, the shadows had grown long and deep. The fire we built crackled loudly, and we huddled close, trying to keep warm. I kept my eyes on the tree line, expecting to see someone emerge, but nothing ever came. It wasn't until later, after we had settled in, that I noticed something strange. The footsteps, whatever was following us, they had stopped. The forest was silent once again, but it wasn't a comforting silence. It felt wrong, hollow, as though something had vanished. I woke up a few hours later, shivering. The fire had burned down to a few glowing embers, but the night was still warm. I stepped out of my tent, hoping some fresh air would calm me. As I stood there, looking at the quiet trees, I noticed something bizarre. The usual sounds of the night, the rustling of leaves, the distant chirp of crickets, were gone. The forest was completely still. Then I heard it, a soft, uneven breathing. It was coming from the woods, just beyond the tree line. My blood ran cold. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was rooted in place, unable to tear my eyes away from the dark. The breathing grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't human, that much was clear. It was shallow, labored, almost as if whatever was out there was struggling to draw air. The sound wasn't far from where we had camped, but the direction was unclear. I felt like whatever was out there was looking for us, and now that it had found us, it was circling closer. A chill ran down my spine as I realized something. Those footsteps earlier, they weren't just following us. They were guiding something toward us, toward the camp. I could feel the presence growing closer. My mind raced with thoughts. Should I wake my friends? But what could I tell them? I didn't want to put them in more danger than they already were. Instead, I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the woods, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. For a moment, there was nothing, just the endless shadows and the faint rustling of leaves. And then I saw it. A figure. Tall, obscured by darkness, but unmistakable. Its form wasn't human. It seemed wrong, like something twisted and unnatural. It stared at me from the edge of the trees, unmoving, its hollow eyes glinting in the faint light of my flashlight. My heart thudded in my chest as I stared back, frozen in place. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure took a step forward, and I could see now, the uneven, staggering gait, as if it wasn't fully human. The outline of its face was blurred, almost as if it wasn't meant to be seen. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished into the woods. The breathing stopped. The silence returned. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. My friends never woke up. By dawn, I convinced myself that whatever it was gone. I woke them and told them we needed to leave, that I wasn't feeling well. None of them questioned it. We hiked out of the forest, and I've never gone back. I've tried to convince myself it was just fear and exhaustion, that I imagined everything. But even now, I can't forget those hollow eyes, staring from the darkness. Whatever it was, I don't believe we were alone that night. It started with a simple evening trip, just me and my partner, leaving the city behind for a quiet night under the stars. We had packed a cooler, a few blankets, and our hiking gear. The plan was to find a secluded spot, away from the noise, to enjoy the night sky. We drove out of town, into the rolling hills, the familiar sights of the city fading behind us. The roads became narrower, winding through forests, the trees towering overhead, blocking out the last of the fading light. By the time we reached a clearing by a small lake, the sun had vanished, leaving us in complete darkness. The spot was perfect. No light pollution, just the stillness of nature. We set up our tent near the water's edge, ate some snacks, and stretched out on our blankets, gazing at the sky. It was peaceful, serene. For a while, we didn't say much, just soaking in the quiet. Around midnight, we decided to take a walk along the shore. The lake was calm, almost like a mirror reflecting the stars above. I felt a sense of tranquility, the kind you only get when you're far from everything. But as we walked, something felt off. The night seemed to stretch out longer than it should have. We could hear nothing, no animals, no rustling leaves, not even the usual sounds of insects. It was too quiet. We stopped, staring out at the lake. The water was black as ink, undisturbed. That's when I noticed it. A figure. It was standing by the water, its shape indistinct against the dark. I called out to my partner, but the words caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't react. It just stood there, watching. I couldn't make out any details, but the feeling of wrongness was overwhelming. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't respond. It stayed perfectly still, just watching. The silence stretched, unbearable now. I wanted to look away, to turn back to the tent, but my feet wouldn't move. My partner, sensing my unease, grabbed my hand and pulled me, whispering, "Let's go." We hurried back to the tent, but as we reached it, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. I kept looking over my shoulder, but there was nothing. The lake and the woods were still and lifeless. We tried to convince ourselves it was just our imagination. Maybe it was a deer or some reflection playing tricks on us. We locked ourselves in the tent and lay there, my heart racing. At some point, I dozed off, but I woke suddenly. It wasn't the sound of footsteps that stirred me. It was the sense of someone watching. I peeked out of the tent, heart pounding, and saw the figure again just a few feet away from the tent. It was closer now, still motionless, still watching. I could feel its presence, an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. Then, without warning, the figure turned and walked into the darkness, fading into the trees. The silence was deafening again except for the sound of my breath, shallow and trembling. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, everything was gone. No figure, no eerie presence. Just the quiet lake, the trees, and the silence. We packed up quickly, leaving before the sun rose. I haven't been back to that spot since. I don't know what we saw, but I know one thing for sure. The woods are still out there, waiting. It was the last day of my trip to the mountains. I had spent the past week hiking, exploring remote trails and basking in the beauty of nature. No phone signal, no distractions, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of leaves. It was peaceful, at least during the day. On my final evening, I decided to take one last walk down to a secluded pond deep in the forest. The air was cool, and the sky was a deep, inky black. The trees stretched high above, casting long shadows that made it feel like the world was shrinking around me. The walk to the pond wasn't long, but it was quiet. Too quiet. I could feel the isolation, the stillness pressing against my chest. It felt as though the world had been hushed just for me. I reached the pond, which glimmered under the dim light of the stars reflecting off the water. I sat down on a rock, letting out a long breath. As I stared into the still pond, something shifted in the water's surface. A ripple formed, spreading outward in slow waves. I leaned in closer, my reflection breaking apart with each wave. But then something else appeared, something underneath the surface. At first, it looked like just another reflection, distorted by the ripples. But then I saw it. Two pale, lifeless eyes staring back at me from the depths. I stumbled back from the water, my breath catching in my throat. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched those eyes slowly rise from the depths. The figure emerged slowly, its movements awkward, unnatural. It was pale, its skin wrinkled and damp like it had been submerged for years. But it wasn't just a reflection. It was real. The figure didn't step fully out of the water. It hovered just above the surface, those hollow eyes still locked onto mine. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. I stumbled backward, my feet slipping on the loose dirt. The figure didn't move, didn't chase me, but its gaze never wavered. I ran, heart racing, lungs burning with every step. The forest around me seemed alive, the trees stretching their branches toward the ground like clawed hands. I didn't stop until I was back at my campsite, my chest heaving. The echo of those hollow eyes burned into my mind. The next morning, I returned to the pond one last time, but there was nothing there, just the still water and the empty forest. Whatever I saw, whatever that thing was gone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching me, hidden somewhere deep in the shadows of the woods. I've always loved spending my weekends exploring nature, far from the city lights and noise. A few friends and I decided to go on a hiking trip into the mountains, remote trails, hidden caves, and the promise of peace. We left early on a Saturday, driving for hours into the wilderness, leaving behind cell service and any form of modern convenience. The trailhead was a quiet spot, surrounded by towering pines and the hum of insects buzzing in the heat. We set off, excited to lose ourselves in the trees and rocks. The trail was rough but rewarding, winding deeper into the forest as the day wore on. We didn't see a single person the entire time, just the distant sounds of birds and the crunch of leaves beneath our feet. We stopped to rest after a few hours, finding a small clearing by a bubbling stream. It was serene, perfect for a break. We filled our bottles with cold water and spread out our packs, eating snacks and laughing. It felt like we were the only people left in the world. After eating, we decided to explore further. The trail continued on, snaking around the mountain, but something felt off. The quiet was louder than before, almost oppressive. My friends joked about how strange the silence was, but I wasn't laughing. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It wasn't until we were deep in the woods that we noticed the marks on the trees. Long, claw-like scratches gouged into the bark, running high and low, as if something large had passed through. I stopped, staring at them. My stomach churned. "Do you think a bear did this?" I asked, pointing. "No way," one of my friends replied, laughing. "Bears don't make marks like that. Look, these are way too high." I nodded, feeling a knot form in my stomach. The idea of a bear, or anything large, hadn't crossed my mind, but these marks were unnatural. We looked around, but the trees seemed lifeless, their silence stretching into an eerie stillness. We pressed on, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. By the time we reached the base of the mountain, the sun was low on the horizon. The shadows of the trees stretched long across the ground. We decided it was time to head back, but something wasn't right. It felt like we were walking in circles, the trail no longer familiar. When we stopped to check our maps, we realized it wasn't the trail that had shifted. It was us. We weren't lost exactly, but we were disoriented, unable to find the landmarks we remembered. The air felt thicker, as though the forest had swallowed everything familiar. We retraced our steps, but nothing looked the same. Every tree felt like a stranger. We finally decided to make camp. It wasn't ideal, but we needed to rest. As night fell, the forest became even more silent. It was a different kind of quiet, one that felt heavy, almost oppressive. The usual sounds of insects and wildlife had vanished, leaving only the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. I couldn't sleep. Something felt off. My friends drifted into restless slumber, but I stayed awake, watching the shadows shift around the fire. Every little noise made me jump. The snap of a twig, the whisper of wind through the trees. I knew something was watching us. I just couldn't explain how I knew. At some point, I heard it. A low, distorted whisper. Faint at first, but growing louder. It came from the trees, as if something was calling to us. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The whisper became clearer, more insistent. Come. Closer. The voice was not human. It was hollow, distant, like it came from the shadows themselves. My pulse quickened as I stared into the darkness, heart pounding. I woke my friends, but the whispering stopped as soon as they opened their eyes. The forest returned to silence. They didn't hear it. They didn't see anything. And as much as I wanted to dismiss it, I knew what I'd heard. The thing, whatever it was, hadn't left us. It was still there, waiting. In the morning, we packed up and made our way back down the mountain, moving as quickly as we could. The woods were still quiet, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. By the time we made it back to the trailhead, I looked behind us one last time. The trees loomed taller, darker, and deep within them, I knew we weren't alone. I used to visit my grandfather's house every summer when I was a kid. It was an old farmhouse, isolated, sitting at the edge of a quiet valley. My parents used to leave me there for weeks while they traveled, and I never minded. Grandpa was old and grumpy, but he told the best stories about the woods that surrounded us. The house itself wasn't much, a weathered wooden structure with creaky floorboards and faded wallpaper. Outside, there were fields of tall grass stretching endlessly, and beyond that, the forest. One evening, as I explored the woods near his house, I noticed something strange. There was an old, abandoned barn deeper into the trees, one I had never seen before. It stood isolated from the rest of the woods, its roof sagging and walls covered in ivy. It was out of place, and curiosity got the better of me. I approached the barn, my steps quiet on the grass. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. There was a faint, almost imperceptible noise, like whispers carried by the wind. I stopped, listening. The whispers seemed to be coming from inside the barn, but there was no sign of life around it. I pushed open the creaking door. Inside, the barn was dark, except for slivers of light filtering through the broken roof. Dust hung in the air, thick and heavy. It smelled of decay, wood, rot, and something else I couldn't place. I could barely see, but I moved cautiously, my heartbeat quickening. That's when I saw it. In the far corner of the barn, barely visible in the dim light, was a figure. A tall, slender shadow that didn't quite belong. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The whispers had grown louder, almost like they were surrounding me now. I strained to see more, but the figure remained in the shadows. Then, slowly, it moved. Not like a human, though. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as if whatever this thing was didn't know how to walk properly. It tilted its head, and for a moment, I thought I saw something in its hollow eyes. The whispers intensified, growing louder, more frantic. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear, the barn now filled with that oppressive silence, only broken by those relentless whispers. And then, from the shadows, I heard a voice. Help me. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It wasn't human either, low and raspy, like it hadn't spoken in centuries. My legs felt like lead, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't respond. The whispers became screams, but they were inside my head. I could feel them, clawing at my mind. The figure stepped closer, its limbs bent awkwardly as if they didn't belong to a living thing, and then, just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. I collapsed to the floor, unable to move or think. My heart thundered in my chest, and the barn was silent again. I sat there for what felt like hours, unsure if the fear or the silence was worse. When I finally managed to stand, I left the barn and didn't look back. The rest of the summer passed without further incident. My grandfather never mentioned the barn, and I never brought it up. To this day, I don't know what I saw, but I know one thing. It wasn't human, and it wasn't supposed to be there. It started as an ordinary trip to the local library. My sister and I were always close, and we spent countless afternoons browsing through rows of old, dusty books. That day, the library felt emptier than usual. The shelves towered over us, and the only sound was the faint creaking of the wooden floor as we walked. We had made our way to the back of the library, past the quiet study rooms and the dimly lit reading areas. The air smelled like old paper and dust. As we wandered further into the maze of bookshelves, I noticed how still everything was. No whispers, no children running, just silence. Even my sister seemed more subdued than usual. "I'll meet you over there," she said, gesturing toward a section I wasn't particularly interested in. I watched her disappear behind a row of shelves, lost in a world of her own. I kept browsing, pulling a book off the shelf and flipping through the pages. Something about the stillness was unsettling. The library wasn't big, but today it felt like a labyrinth, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were the only ones there. I moved toward the back, deeper into the old section of the library where the shelves creaked beneath my feet. At the end of the row, something caught my eye. A table nestled in the corner, covered with old, dusty books. One of them wasn't like the others. The cover was worn, pages yellowed and brittle, but there was something different. Curious, I picked it up and dusted it off. The title was barely legible, faded with time. Whispers from the Void. My stomach sank. I opened the book, but the pages were blank, completely blank. A wave of unease washed over me, but I couldn't bring myself to put it down. As I flipped through the pages, a whisper escaped from the shadows behind me. I froze. The sound was faint. Just a whisper, but it wasn't from anyone I could see. The air shifted around me and I could feel eyes watching from the darkness. I turned, but there was nothing. Just the tall shelves stretching into the dim corners of the library. My heart thudded against my chest and I knew something wasn't right. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the silent aisles. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. Only the low, endless whisper that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. I clutched the book tightly and began to back away. I had to find my sister. I needed to get out of there. The whispering followed me, trailing like a shadow. I moved as quickly as I could, my breath hitching with every step. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Suddenly, I heard my sister's voice from further down the hall. "Hey, what's going on? Are you okay?" Relief flooded me, but it was short-lived. Her voice sounded distant, echoing strangely. "I'm here," I yelled, but it felt hollow, as though my voice wasn't reaching her. "Where are you?" No response. The whispers grew louder, drowning out any trace of my sister's voice. I turned the corner, hoping to find her, but the library seemed to twist and stretch before my eyes. The rows of shelves seemed endless now, stretching far beyond what I remembered. "Please, just tell me where you are," I shouted, my voice breaking. Silence. And then I saw her. She was standing at the end of the hall, but something was wrong. Her figure wasn't quite right. Her back was arched unnaturally, and she wasn't moving like she usually did. It was as if she were floating. "Please come back," I cried, my legs trembling as I rushed toward her. But as I drew closer, I noticed her face. It wasn't my sister's. The eyes that stared back at me were hollow, empty, devoid of anything human. A sinister grin stretched across her lips. "No," I whispered, backing away. The whispers filled the air once more, louder now like a chorus of unseen voices. The library seemed to stretch endlessly around me, each shadow deeper and darker than before. I turned to run, but the endless corridors shifted, moving as if the library itself was alive. I couldn't escape. Then, from the depths of the shadows, I heard a voice, calm, serene, yet undeniably chilling. "You're not supposed to leave." I closed my eyes, clutching the book to my chest. When I opened them again, everything was silent. The whispers had stopped. The library was still, eerily quiet. But when I turned around, my sister was gone. And so was the book. I'll never forget that day. It started out ordinary enough. My friends and I decided to take a spontaneous trip to the nearby lake. We weren't expecting anything out of the ordinary, just a few hours of peace, some fishing, and maybe a swim if we felt like it. Nothing seemed unusual as we packed up and drove down the winding dirt road leading to the lake. We'd been going to this spot for years. It was remote, surrounded by trees and hills, with no cell service and few visitors, the kind of place where you could truly get away from everything. When we arrived, the sun was high in the sky, and the lake shimmered under its light. We set up a small camp by the shore, blankets, coolers filled with drinks, and a fishing line tossed into the water. It was the kind of day where you lose track of time, relaxing in the warm sun. But as the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere began to shift. The first sign came when we noticed the birds went quiet. The chirping had gradually died down, but we didn't think much of it. It wasn't until we glanced up at the sky that something truly strange happened. The clouds seemed to darken, even though the sun was still shining brightly. It was as if the world had turned gray for a moment, without warning. I looked around, feeling a knot of discomfort form in my stomach. My friends were laughing, oblivious, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I wandered a bit away from the camp, standing at the edge of the water, staring out into the lake. That's when I saw it, a figure, standing at the far side of the lake. It wasn't moving, just standing there as though it were staring directly at me. I told myself it had to be a trick of the light or someone from a distant campsite. But no one ever came to this part of the lake. The figure was still too far away for me to make out any details, but the sensation of being watched deepened. I called out to my friends, trying to shake off the unease. They didn't hear me. Or if they did, they didn't seem concerned. I didn't want to ruin the day with my paranoia, so I pushed the feeling aside. It wasn't until later that evening, when we were sitting around the campfire, that things got worse. The air had grown colder, the sun long set, leaving us with only the dim glow of the fire. The quiet was now oppressive, a stillness that felt unnatural. It wasn't like the calm of nature, it was like something had swallowed the sounds of the night. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence. We talked, but the conversation felt forced, the laughter awkward. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling eyes on me. I couldn't explain it, but the feeling of being watched was unbearable. Every time I looked around, I saw nothing but trees and darkness. Then, from out of nowhere, we heard it. Soft, distorted whispers. They weren't coming from any direction. It was as if they surrounded us, echoing in the stillness. I strained to make out the words, but whatever was being said was too faint, too unnatural. I couldn't bring myself to ignore it anymore. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, my voice shaky. They shook their heads, looking at me like I was imagining things. But then I saw it again, the figure, much closer now. It was standing at the edge of the trees, watching us. It was too dark to make out any features, only the faint silhouette, almost human, but not quite. The whispering intensified, as if the figure was breathing the sound into the air. Panic set in. I felt the cold rush through my veins, and my body trembled uncontrollably. I tried to call out again, but no words would come. The figure moved a step closer. It wasn't walking. It glided, as if pulled by some unseen force. The whispers stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I felt my friends tugging at my arm, pulling me toward the campfire, but I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. It felt like whatever this thing was, it had me trapped. My friends didn't see it, didn't hear the whispers. They told me to snap out of it, convinced I was just spooked by the isolation. But then something happened that I'll never forget. The figure, which had been standing still for what felt like forever, suddenly turned and disappeared into the trees. One moment it was there, and the next, gone, like it had never existed. I tried to explain to my friends what I saw, what I felt, but they couldn't see it. The whispers returned for a brief moment, distant and faint. And then, just like before, silence. I've never been able to return to that lake. To this day, I don't know what I saw or what it wanted. All I know is that something was there, something that wasn't human, and no one else ever saw it. It was a quiet evening, and I had decided to go for a walk along the old, unused rail trail that ran near the edge of town. The trail had been out of service for decades, overgrown with thick underbrush and left to the elements. A relic from another time, it was now little more than a forgotten path through the woods. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the trail. I didn't expect to run into anyone. The town had grown quiet in recent years, and I figured it was the perfect time to clear my head. There wasn't much to hear other than the distant sound of the trees rustling in the wind and the occasional creak of an old sign swaying overhead. As I walked further along the trail, a chill started to settle in my bones. It wasn't just the cold air. There was something off about the silence, something unnatural. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like I was being watched. I shook it off, blaming my nerves, and pressed on. About halfway down the trail, I came across an old wooden bench. It was weathered and half-rotted, covered in moss and dirt. I decided to sit for a moment, pulling my jacket tighter around me. The woods around me seemed darker now, the shadows deeper, the wind sharper. I glanced up at the fading light of the horizon, the last hint of twilight vanishing into the thick trees. That's when I heard it, a faint, barely audible whisper carried on the wind. I strained to hear, but there was nothing, just the silence again. Maybe my imagination, I thought. But then, a second whisper, closer this time, like it was coming from the trees behind me. My breath hitched and I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. I turned slowly, my pulse quickening. The woods were still. The trees loomed over the trail like silent sentinels, their branches creaking and swaying. I told myself to calm down, that it was probably just an animal. But deep down, I knew better. There was no animal making those whispers. It was like something, or someone, was trying to call out to me. I tried to walk away from the bench, but the whispers followed. They were louder now, as if they were closing in on me, their words indistinct but somehow menacing. I glanced behind, but there was nothing. Only the trees, silent and watchful. The trail curved ahead, disappearing into the shadows. I kept moving, but the whispers didn't stop. They seemed to come from all directions now, surrounding me like a dark fog. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. Was I losing my mind? Or was something out there? Something beyond explanation. Suddenly, I tripped over something in the grass, falling hard onto the dirt path. My hands scraped against the ground as I caught myself. Looking down, I saw it. A small, broken mirror lying face up, shards of glass reflecting nothing but my terrified expression. The whispers turned to a low, guttural whisper, almost like a chant. It wasn't in any language I recognized, but I could feel it resonating in my bones. I scrambled to my feet, my heart thudding wildly in my chest. That's when I saw them. Shadowy figures emerging from the trees. They weren't human, but they moved like people. Tall and hunched, their forms twisted and obscured by the dark. Their eyes glowed faintly, empty and hollow. They didn't speak, but their whispers continued, growing louder. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to run, but my legs felt frozen, rooted to the spot. The shadows moved closer, closing in on me like a wave of darkness. Then, just as suddenly as they appeared, they stopped. The whispers faded, and the figures vanished into the trees once more. I stood there, breathless, staring into the darkness. When I dared to move again, there was nothing, only the echo of silence. The mirror lay shattered on the ground, its broken glass reflecting nothing but the void of the forest. I didn't stay long after that. I turned around and walked back, never looking over my shoulder again. I never liked going to the old library. It wasn't that I didn't enjoy reading, but something about that place always unsettled me. It was located deep in town, far from the bustling streets, surrounded by tall, looming trees that seemed to trap the library in perpetual dusk. That day, I had gone in looking for a quiet place to work on a research project. The main hall stretched out in front of me, filled with towering bookshelves packed with forgotten volumes. The air smelled of old paper and dust, like something had been left untouched for too long. I always felt like the library was too quiet, too still, as though the very walls were watching. I found a desk tucked into a corner near the back. The sun barely made it through the high, cracked windows, casting long, dim shadows across the worn wooden floor. I set up my laptop, opened my books, and tried to focus, but the oppressive quiet gnawed at the edges of my concentration. Hours passed, or at least it felt like it. I had no real sense of time in that place. Every creak, every faint whisper of wind from outside seemed magnified in the silence. I was halfway through a particularly dry section of text when I noticed something unusual. A faint noise, barely audible at first, like someone breathing just behind me. I froze, scanning the empty library, but there was no one there. The sound grew louder, sharper, like someone was just inches from my ear. I turned slowly, my pulse quickening. No one. The breathy noise became a low whisper, as though someone was right there speaking into my mind. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but it felt off, like the voice wasn't human. I pushed my chair back, my hand trembling as I tried to steady myself. I wanted to run, but something about the stillness of the library held me in place. Then came a distinct echoing creak from the far corner of the room. I didn't want to look, but my head turned on its own. In the dim light, I saw something moving. Shadowy and indistinct, it wavered near the tallest shelf. A figure, barely formed, drifting in and out of sight. My breath caught in my throat. The whispering grew louder, distorted, like it was all around me now. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. It felt like the library itself had swallowed my voice. As I watched, the figure began to shift, growing more distinct. Its features were blurred, but I could see now. Hollow eyes, a twisted, gaping mouth. It didn't move like a person. It drifted, flowing across the room, closer to me. The whispering became a scream, but in my head, not from any source I could find. I stumbled backward, knocking over my chair. The figure didn't stop. It didn't seem to notice me. It was as if it had no awareness of anything but its own existence. It drifted toward the front of the library, toward the rows of ancient books, each step sending a shudder through the floor. Tears streamed down my face as I stumbled out the door, never looking back. The library remained silent, as if it had never noticed I was gone. I don't know what that thing was, and I don't want to find out. But I know I'll never step foot in that library again. The day had been perfect. We set out in the early afternoon to visit a small, desolate lake hidden deep in the hills. It wasn't a place anyone went often. Locals didn't talk about it much. My friends and I had stumbled upon it once before during a hike, and something about the isolation drew us back. The drive was long and winding, and by the time we arrived, the sun was just starting to dip behind the trees. The lake was peaceful, the water shimmering under the fading light. We were the only ones there, and it felt like our own private sanctuary. We unpacked our things, set up our chairs, and cracked open a few beers. The air was still and cool, but something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The silence wasn't natural. There was a kind of tension in the air that made the back of my neck prickle. I shrugged it off, assuming I was just imagining things. We spent a few hours lounging by the water, laughing, talking about nothing in particular. The stillness of the lake seemed to stretch endlessly in front of us, but with each passing hour, the quiet felt less like a serene escape and more like something was watching from beyond. It wasn't until the sun had fully set that things began to feel wrong. The faintest whisper of a breeze started stirring the surface of the water, creating ripples that seemed to echo far too loudly in the quiet. The shadows stretched longer, and we started to hear distant noises, something scraping, dragging, far in the woods. My friends didn't seem bothered, but I felt my stomach knot. I tried to dismiss the feeling as nerves from being so isolated, but something in the air felt wrong. Every so often I'd glance toward the tree line, expecting to see someone or something. But there was nothing. Just trees, silent and still. As the last bit of light faded, we all decided it was time to head back. The trip back was uneventful, and we didn't talk much. The tension between us palpable. It wasn't until we were far away from the lake that things got truly strange. That's when my phone buzzed. A text popped up. "I'm still there." I froze. My heart began to pound as I looked around the car. No one else had mentioned anything about sending a text. I quickly unlocked my phone to check who it was from. The message wasn't from any of my friends. It was a number I didn't recognize. "I'm still there," it read again. My breath hitched as I realized the sender wasn't just talking about the lake. They were still there. I looked out the window, my eyes scanning the dark fields and forests rushing past. But there was no one. No car following us. No signs of movement. Just the empty, winding road. My phone buzzed once more, and this time the message read, "I've been following you since the lake." I clenched the steering wheel tighter. My mind raced. I wanted to believe it was some kind of prank, but deep down, I knew that wasn't possible. My friends hadn't received any message like that. No one could have known we were at the lake. We pulled over at a small, desolate gas station on the edge of town. The place was eerily quiet, and the flickering neon sign seemed to reflect the same unsettling silence from earlier. I stepped out, trying to shake off the creeping paranoia, but the world outside felt off. As I filled the gas tank, I kept glancing back toward the car, waiting for something. Anything. A noise from behind made me whip around. Nothing. But I could swear someone was watching from the darkened edge of the forest. Their shadows stretched impossibly long under the gas station's weak lights. I hurried back to the car, my phone gripped tightly in my hand. As I slid into the driver's seat, my heart skipped a beat when the screen lit up again. "I'm still here." This time, the message came with a photo, one of the lake. But it wasn't the peaceful image we remembered. The water was dark, and in the distance, barely visible in the fading light, something moved, something tall and unnatural. The last message followed. "I'll be with you, always." I never looked back as I drove. I couldn't. It was an ordinary Saturday when we decided to explore the old lake. It wasn't just any lake, it was surrounded by dense woods, hidden far from the main road. My friends and I had stumbled upon it years ago while hiking, but never spent much time there. Today, curiosity got the better of us. We packed a picnic and drove out, eager to spend the afternoon away from the usual noise of the city. The day was perfect at first. The sun was warm, the air was fresh, and the lake itself was calm and inviting. We set up our blankets near the shore, and for a few hours it felt like the world had stopped. We swam, took photos, and laughed under the canopy of trees. The forest around us seemed alive, buzzing with insects and birds. But there was something else, something that felt off. As the sun started to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the lake, we began to hear faint whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, clearer this time, like voices carried from the depths of the woods. I turned to my friends, but none of them seemed to hear it. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. They shook their heads, focused on the lake. I stood up, looking toward the trees. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, and now I was certain I wasn't imagining it. They weren't words, just faint, distorted murmurs, like something from a dream, calling out from the forest. "We should go back," I said, my heart starting to race. The feeling of unease was creeping in, swallowing any sense of peace we had earlier. "No way," one of my friends laughed. "We've got another hour of daylight, we're fine." I hesitated, wanting to stay but feeling that nagging, primal instinct to get out. Still, we stayed a little longer, hoping the sounds would fade. But they didn't. It was like the forest was alive, its very trees whispering to each other. The murmurs were all around us now, growing louder, almost like they were speaking directly to us. One of my friends, Mark, turned white as he stared at the woods, his eyes wide and searching. "I swear I hear something," he said, his voice trembling. "It's not normal." I glanced at the others. None of them seemed to be reacting as strongly, but I could see the tension in their faces. The air had turned colder and the woods were shifting. Silent one moment, then alive with rustling leaves and distant sounds. The sun had disappeared behind the horizon, casting the area in shadows. Everything seemed to grow darker, more foreboding. Mark stood up, his voice barely audible. "We need to go. Now." The others agreed, though reluctantly. We quickly packed our things, keeping our eyes on the trees, half expecting something to emerge from them. The whispers grew louder as we walked toward the car, but no one spoke, too caught up in the creeping dread. When we reached the car, I turned back one last time, searching the forest for any sign of life. That's when I saw it, just a glimpse of something moving between the trees. It wasn't human, though. It was long and twisted, like a shadow, but with shape. It vanished in an instant, but I knew it had been watching us. My friends didn't see it, and I didn't say a word. I just got in the car, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. We drove away from the lake in silence, leaving the strange murmurs behind us. As we drove back toward the main road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us from the darkness. I've never been back to that lake, and I never planned to. Whatever was out there, it felt alive, watching, waiting. And I know now, some things are better left unexplored. I wasn't the kind of person who believed in ghosts or the supernatural. I've always been a logical thinker, someone who dismissed old tales and rumors as nothing more than silly distractions. That changed one night on a solitary trip to the old family lake house. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small cabin tucked deep in the woods by a quiet, remote lake. My family used to go there when I was a kid, but we hadn't been back in years. After hearing it was in rough shape, I decided to check it out one weekend, just to make sure everything was still standing. The drive took longer than I remembered, the road winding through dense forest that swallowed any light from the moon. The lake house itself was hidden from view until you were nearly upon it. It stood there, dark and silent, its windows covered in grime and cobwebs. I grabbed my flashlight and headed inside. The interior was in worse condition than I expected. Dust and mold covered everything. Cobwebs hung like torn curtains, and the wooden floorboards creaked under every step. I opened the windows to let in some fresh air, though I wasn't sure if that was going to help with the oppressive silence. That evening, after checking for any signs of wildlife, I decided to explore the surrounding area. The lake itself was calm, reflecting the trees in a perfect mirror, but the air had a strange stillness to it, as if something had been watching and waiting for me to arrive. As night fell, I made a fire outside, sitting by the lake to enjoy the peace. The crackling flames didn't do much to comfort me, though. The woods around me seemed to hold their breath, the shadows growing deeper and more menacing as the minutes passed. It was around midnight when I first heard it, a faint whispering, barely audible but persistent, carried on the wind. I froze, listening, my skin crawling. The whispers didn't come from any particular direction but seemed to be all around me. I stood, heart racing, and scanned the trees, but I saw nothing. The silence returned. But the unease wouldn't go away. I convinced myself it was just the wind, some sound that had traveled from miles away and got distorted in the stillness. I went back inside and locked the door behind me, the sound of my own breath echoing in the empty cabin. I slept fitfully that night, plagued by strange dreams. I kept waking up, feeling like something, or someone, was watching me from the shadows. Each time I opened my eyes, the room seemed darker than before. The next morning, I decided to take a walk around the lake. The sun was bright, the forest alive with birdsong, but something still felt off. As I walked, I found old, faded footprints in the dirt. My heart skipped a beat when I realized they weren't mine. They looked much older, but perfectly preserved in the soft ground. I kept walking, pushing away the growing sense of dread. That's when I saw them. Footprints leading from the cabin, circling around the lake. But not just a few. The footprints stretched as far as I could see, as if something had been walking these woods for years. I turned back towards the cabin, but before I could make it, I saw something by the water's edge. A figure stood there, just beyond the trees, its form indistinct, its face obscured by shadows. I froze, unable to move as I stared at it. It wasn't human. Not really. The figure's shape was wrong, its posture unnatural, like something trying to mimic a person but failing. Panic set in as I realized it was watching me, tilting its head as if studying me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The whispering started again, louder this time, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the wind. It was coming from inside my head. Leave, leave, leave. The whisper repeated itself, growing louder, closer, until I couldn't tell if it was real or in my head. I turned to run, but the figure was gone, vanished into the trees. I made it back to the cabin, slamming the door shut and locking it again. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I spent the rest of the day packing up and preparing to leave. The whispers never stopped. They echoed in my head long after I was back in my car, long after I was miles away from that place. To this day, I haven't been able to forget that trip. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, I can still hear those whispers. Not out loud, but in my mind, like they're waiting, always watching. It started as an ordinary Sunday drive through the countryside. I'd packed a few snacks, some music, and planned to spend the day exploring the old back roads, places I hadn't visited in years. The sun was shining, casting long shadows across the fields as I drove along, lost in the quiet hum of the engine and the occasional chirping of birds. My destination was a small, forgotten town deep in the woods. It wasn't marked on any maps or GPS. It was one of those places that only showed up if you knew where to look. I had vague memories of visiting there as a kid, but everything had changed since then. The road wound tighter into the trees, and as I drove deeper, the world felt as if it was folding in around me. I was eager for the quiet, for a break from the city, but the stillness of the woods began to feel oppressive, almost too quiet. It was as though the trees were watching, the silence pressing down like a weight. Eventually, I reached the old town, or what was left of it. Time had all but erased it. The town was overgrown with vines, the wooden houses leaning in on themselves, abandoned and forgotten. There were no signs of life, no people, no vehicles, just a faint echo of the past. I parked my car near the edge of what was once Main Street and started walking. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, cracked, and covered in weeds. The air smelled damp and musty, like something had been left to rot. I passed the old general store, its windows broken and faded posters peeling away. I peeked inside and saw remnants of a life long gone, dusty shelves, faded signs, and the unmistakable scent of decay. Something about it made my skin crawl, but curiosity drove me forward. I wandered through the town, stumbling over old bricks and rusted metal, feeling as though I was stepping through a memory. Every sound seemed amplified in the quiet, my footsteps echoing off the crumbling walls, the creak of dry wood, the distant call of birds. It was peaceful, yet unsettling. As the sun began to set, I reached the outskirts of town. I sat on an old stone bench, trying to take in the view of the overgrown fields and the distant horizon. The quiet seemed to stretch forever, the woods pressing closer with each passing moment. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible at first. A whisper. It wasn't human, but something inhuman. I froze, my heart pounding. I strained my ears, listening, but the woods remained silent except for the rustling of leaves in the breeze. The whisper grew louder, as if it was circling around me, distant but persistent. I stood, my hands trembling, and turned in a slow circle, searching for the source. The woods were darkening, the last light of day vanishing behind the trees. Then, just beyond the edge of my vision, I saw it. Movement. A shadow, shifting among the trees. My breath caught in my throat. It didn't look human. It was tall, too tall, and its figure twisted unnaturally as if it didn't belong in the world. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. The whisper became a soft, eerie chant now, growing louder and more insistent. The figure moved closer, the shadow stretching and twisting as it approached. I could feel its presence, as if it were staring at me with hollow, empty eyes. It wasn't human, not in the way I knew. It was something older, something that had been waiting for a long, long time. Tears blurred my vision as I stumbled backward. My mind raced, trying to find an explanation, but nothing made sense. The figure was no longer a shape, but a dark void, surrounding me in silence and fear. Just when I thought I couldn't bear it anymore, the whisper faded. The figure stood still for a moment, then turned, vanishing into the woods as silently as it had come. I stood there, trembling, as the night fully set in. The woods were silent once again, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. That thing, whatever it was still out there, watching, waiting. I slowly made my way back to my car, heart still racing. As I drove away, I glanced back at the town once more, the memories of the whisper still echoing in my mind. I haven't gone back since. It was just a normal Sunday afternoon, and I had decided to take a long drive out to the outskirts of town. The weather was crisp and clear, the kind of day that makes you want to get away from the noise of the city. I hadn't been out this way before, but something about the empty roads and open fields had always called to me. I drove down winding country roads, surrounded by endless fields of tall grass. It was so quiet that the only sounds were the hum of the car engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The air smelled fresh, and for once there was no one around. I appreciated the peace, letting my mind wander. As I drove, I noticed an old barn sitting off in the distance. It wasn't much, just a weathered wooden structure surrounded by overgrown weeds, but something about it tugged at me. I couldn't quite explain why, but I felt an inexplicable pull toward it. So I decided to take a detour, leaving the main road behind. When I parked and stepped out of the car, the silence was overwhelming. It wasn't a comforting silence, though. It felt oppressive, as if the very earth was holding its breath. I approached the barn cautiously. The wood creaked beneath my feet as I made my way closer. The door hung open slightly, swinging faintly in the breeze. I hesitated but stepped inside. The interior was dark, lit only by the faint slivers of sunlight that managed to filter through cracks in the old wood. The place smelled like damp hay and decay. My footsteps echoed, the sound amplified in the stillness. The barn wasn't empty. In the far corner, partially hidden by shadows, stood something tall and thin. I wasn't sure what it was. At first, I thought it was just old farm equipment or debris. But as I drew closer, I realized it wasn't. It wasn't human, but neither was it entirely unfamiliar. Its form was elongated, with arms that seemed too long, bending unnaturally. Its face, if you could call it that, was hollow and void. No features to speak of, just a black void where the eyes should have been. It stood completely still, like a statue, as if waiting. My heart raced. I wanted to turn and run, but I couldn't move. It felt like the barn had shifted, trapping me in a place with some unseen force. The figure didn't move, didn't react. It simply stood there, watching. And then it spoke. Its voice wasn't human. It wasn't even a voice in the way we think of it. It was more of a whispering thought that seemed to echo inside my own head. "Why are you here?" I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. The question hung in the air, unanswered. The barn door creaked louder, and I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I turned, but there was no one there. The oppressive silence returned, but now there was something else. Something watching. The figure in the corner shifted, just slightly, as if it had taken a step toward me. My legs finally moved, carrying me in a frantic stumble toward the door. As I reached for the handle, I looked back, catching a glimpse of something in the shadows. It wasn't just the figure now. There were more, a dozen, maybe more, standing motionless in the dark corners of the barn, all watching me with those empty voids for eyes. I couldn't escape them. The door wouldn't open. I turned back, heart pounding, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The barn felt like it was closing in, folding around me. Then I saw it, the face of one of them. So close now. It was right in front of me, and still it didn't have eyes, just a featureless black void. And yet, I felt it staring deep into me, past my skin and into my soul. The whisper came again. Louder now. "Why are you here?" This time, I heard my own voice answer, trembling and weak. I don't know, but I did know. I knew something had been waiting for me. It wanted something, something I couldn't understand. In that moment, I realized that leaving the barn wasn't an option, and neither was forgetting. The night had been uneventful at first. I had decided to take a long drive along the old highway that cut through the desolate plains. It wasn't a particularly scenic route, just endless stretches of cracked pavement and empty fields, stretching far beyond what the eye could see. The only light came from my headlights and the occasional flicker of my dashboard. The quiet was almost oppressive. I usually enjoyed solitude, but this felt different, more isolated, more oppressive. As I drove, I kept glancing at my rearview mirror, half expecting to see the headlights of another vehicle trailing behind. But there was nothing. No other cars, no signs of life. Just the endless road and the hum of my engine. It wasn't until I reached a stretch of road where the horizon curved slightly that something caught my attention. Off to the side, barely visible beneath a thick layer of dust and fog, was an old gas station. I couldn't recall ever seeing it before, but something about it made me slow down. The building was worn, paint peeling, and the sign above it flickered weakly in the night. I decided to stop. It wasn't as if I had much else to do. My phone had lost a signal hours ago and the gas gauge was hovering near empty. Pulling into the station, I cut the engine and stepped out into the stillness. The air was colder than I expected, biting at my skin as I stretched. The station looked abandoned. Cobwebs clung to the windows, and the front door creaked ominously when I pushed it open. Inside, everything was coated in dust. The aisles were empty, shelves leaning precariously, and there was a heavy silence that pressed down on me. I checked the register. Empty. The shelves were stocked, but there wasn't a single item that looked untouched in decades. My footsteps echoed as I wandered further inside, drawn by a sense of curiosity mixed with unease. That's when I heard it, the faintest sound, like a whisper on the edge of hearing. I stopped, my breath hitching. The noise wasn't coming from inside. It was outside, near the side of the building, like someone was dragging something heavy across the gravel. I moved toward the door and cracked it open. Nothing but the dark stretch of road and the fog that clung to the horizon. My heart thumped harder, and I stepped back inside, telling myself it was probably just my imagination. But then, I heard it again, closer this time. A dragging sound, slower, heavier. I didn't dare go outside, but I stood frozen, waiting for whatever it was to come into view. The noise stopped, as if whatever had been making it had reached the edge of the building, and then silence again. I forced myself to move back toward the register. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, trying to reconnect to any signal, but the screen stayed blank. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there was still watching. I had almost convinced myself to leave when I heard a voice. Soft. Low. Hello? My stomach twisted. It wasn't like any human voice I'd ever heard. Hollow, distorted, as though the words had been dragged through something sinister. I backed further into the station, heart racing. "Who's there?" I called, but my voice shook. The silence stretched. Then came the whisper again, closer. "Why are you here?" I didn't have an answer. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe someone was playing some kind of cruel prank. Or maybe I was losing my mind. But there was no way to rationalize what was happening. Then I saw it. A figure emerged from the fog, moving with an unnatural gait. Its limbs were too long, bent at angles they shouldn't have been. Its face was shadowed, but I could see eyes, dark, hollow pits where the light should have been. I stumbled backward, knocking into a shelf. "No! No!" I screamed, my voice cracking. The thing didn't respond. It continued to move toward me, silent but relentless. Desperation set in. I didn't think, I just ran, back toward the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I shoved the door open, not even bothering to check behind me. The fog outside was thicker now, swallowing the road, the station, everything. I sprinted, not caring where I was going, only knowing I couldn't stay there. My legs burned, but I didn't stop, didn't look back, not until I found my car and jumped inside. When I glanced in the rear-view mirror, there was nothing there, just the road, stretching on endlessly. But I knew whatever had followed me, whatever had been waiting in the shadows of that gas station, wasn't gone. It was still out there, and it wouldn't stop. It was a quiet evening when my friends and I decided to take a drive out to the old orchard at the edge of town. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the rolling hills, and the air was crisp. We had heard stories about the orchard, about how it had once been a thriving farm, but now lay abandoned, overgrown with wild grass and tangled vines. None of us really knew what to expect, but something about the place drew us there. Maybe it was the thrill of something forgotten, something lost to time. The old farmhouse at the center of the orchard stood there, half collapsed, its windows shattered and roof caved in. The wooden beams creaked softly in the wind, as if the house itself was moaning. We parked the car at the edge of the orchard and walked deeper into the field. The ground beneath our feet was uneven, covered in fallen apples and weeds. The air smelled earthy, and there was a faint sweetness from the ripened fruit still hanging from the trees. As we approached the farmhouse, the feeling of being watched set in. It wasn't the kind of eerie quiet you'd expect. No birds sang, no rustling of leaves. It was dead quiet. Too quiet. We made our way inside, the wooden floorboards groaning beneath us. The place was a mess. Old furniture scattered, walls splintered, and dust floating through the air like whispers. A sense of unease clung to the room, heavier with each passing second. It wasn't just the silence. It was as if something had been waiting in the shadows for us. One of my friends, Sarah, wandered into the next room. I followed behind, but stopped when I noticed something odd. In the corner of the room, there was a chair. No, two chairs. Both were facing each other, but they were old, cracked, as if they hadn't been touched in years. The legs were splintered and dust coated the seats like a film. What disturbed me most was the way they seemed to be positioned, like they had been placed deliberately, waiting for something or someone. "Why are the chairs like that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Sarah replied, frowning. "It's creepy." We both stood there, staring at the chairs, the silence pressing down harder. I had the sudden, irrational thought that someone, or something, might be sitting there, just out of sight. As we explored further, we came across the kitchen. The cabinets were open, broken plates and jars scattered on the floor. It was here that we found the most unsettling thing of all, a photograph. It was crumpled, lying on the countertop. A family of 4 stared back at us. The man and woman smiled weakly, while 2 children sat on either side of them. What caught our attention wasn't the photo itself, but the absence of their faces. The photo had been torn, their features missing as though someone had tried to erase them. All that remained were empty eyes, hollow and void of life. "What happened here?" Sarah whispered. Her voice trembled. "I don't know," I replied, my throat dry. As we turned to leave, I noticed something moving outside the shattered window. A figure, thin, tall, standing in the distance just beyond the trees. I couldn't make out any features, only the silhouette of someone or something watching us from the edge of the orchard. My heart pounded and I stepped back, whispering, "Do you see that?" Sarah followed my gaze, her eyes widening. I saw it too. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching. Its presence felt ancient, as though it had been waiting for us to arrive. "We need to get out of here," I said, grabbing her hand. As we hurried toward the car, I kept glancing back, half expecting to see something, anything, trailing behind us. But there was nothing. The figure remained distant, still unmoving. Once we reached the car and drove away, I stole one last glance in the rearview mirror. The orchard was behind us, the farmhouse a dark silhouette against the fading light, and still I felt that unseen gaze following us. To this day, I can't explain what we saw or didn't see, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever it was waiting, and it's still out there. It was late summer, and my friends and I decided to take a spontaneous trip to an old remote cabin in the woods. But this wasn't your typical cabin-in-the-woods getaway. No flickering lights, no whispers of ghosts. Instead, it was a well-maintained retreat, far from civilization, nestled at the edge of a serene, winding lake. The cabin was beautiful, its wooden exterior weathered but solid, surrounded by towering pines and the soft echo of crickets. We packed our gear, set up by the dock, and spent the day lounging by the water, soaking in the sun, and enjoying the peaceful isolation. The place had a strange charm, almost too perfect, like it had been untouched by time. But that sense of stillness unsettled me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something about this place wasn't right. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness stretched across the lake, we gathered around a bonfire, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows. The woods were quiet, the only sounds being the crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. But as the night wore on, I started to notice something. Something off, something watching. I didn't say anything at first. I thought maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. The others seemed relaxed, laughing and enjoying themselves. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was someone, or something, lurking just beyond the trees. It started small, barely noticeable at first. Shadows flitting between the trees, just out of sight. The sound of footsteps crunching leaves, but no one else seemed to hear them. My pulse quickened and I kept turning, expecting to catch a glimpse of someone, but there was nothing. Or so I thought. As I watched the trees, I noticed the darkness seemed to deepen, more oppressive, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. Then came the whispering. Soft at first, like the wind, but growing louder, more insistent. It wasn't human speech, but something deeper, more guttural. "Come closer." I froze. The voice wasn't coming from the woods. It was closer, much closer. I could feel it in my bones, vibrating through the air like it was right behind me. My stomach turned. I turned around slowly, and that's when I saw them. A figure stood at the edge of the firelight, barely visible. It wasn't human, not entirely. Its form was distorted, like it was bending in ways it shouldn't. Too tall, too thin. Its face was a hollow void. No features, no eyes, just darkness. The whispers came again, louder this time. "Come." I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, my mind racing, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. The others, still by the fire, didn't seem to notice. I wanted to scream, to call out, but no sound would come. Then, like a flicker of a dream, the figure disappeared, swallowed by the trees. The whispering faded, but the silence that followed was even more unnerving. When I finally found my voice, I managed to mumble to my friends, trying to act calm, though my hands shook uncontrollably. They brushed off my concerns, laughing and calling me paranoid. We stayed up a little longer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, something that had never truly left. That night, I lay awake, listening to every creak of the cabin, every snap of a twig outside. When morning came, the air felt different. The woods seemed quiet, peaceful even. But as we packed our things and left the cabin behind, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder as if something, or someone, was still there, watching us from the shadows. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip with a group of friends. We decided to take a hike through a dense, unfamiliar forest. No cabins, no gas stations, just trees and nature for miles. I wasn't the outdoorsy type, but something about getting away from the city's chaos sounded appealing. We parked at a trailhead that felt like it hadn't seen visitors in years. The road was overgrown, and the air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. Our group of 5 took our first steps into the forest, the sunlight filtering through the canopy above. It was peaceful, serene, or so I thought. About an hour into the hike, things began to feel off. The path we'd been following seemed to narrow, the trees closing in around us. We'd all become quiet, unsure if we were heading the right way. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, distant birds, had fallen silent. It was like we were walking through some uncharted, forgotten place. "Are we even on the trail anymore?" one of my friends asked, her voice uncertain. I stopped and looked around. The trees were so thick, and the sunlight barely broke through. It felt unnatural. But before I could suggest turning back, we noticed something strange. A figure, just a glimpse, moving deeper into the woods. "Did anyone else see that?" someone whispered, their voice barely audible. We all exchanged uneasy glances. The figure had been too tall, too dark. None of us could make out its features, but we could feel its presence. It didn't belong in these woods. "We should follow it," someone said, their voice shaking. Reluctantly, we pressed on. The deeper we went, the more unsettling it became. The forest seemed to shift, twisting into something darker. The trees grew taller, the air growing colder. Every step felt heavier, as if the very ground beneath us was resisting our presence. Hours passed, or so it felt. The light grew dim, the woods silent except for the crunch of our footsteps. The figure was always just out of sight, moving further away. We wanted to call out, to demand answers, but our voices felt frozen in our throats. Suddenly, one of my friends stopped walking, their face pale. Where did everyone go?" they whispered. I spun around. The others had vanished. No trace, no sound. Just me and the forest. My heart began to pound in my chest as I realized I was alone. surrounded by trees that felt alive. I called out, but there was no response. My friends had disappeared, and the silence returned. I wandered aimlessly, trying to retrace my steps, but the forest seemed to shift with every attempt. It felt like the trees were closing in on me, squeezing me tighter. Then I heard it, a faint whispering. Voices, but not human. They sounded hollow, like they were echoing from the very woods themselves. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was haunting, sorrowful. I tried to run, but my legs gave out, the ground beneath me uneven and slippery. As I struggled to my feet, I saw the figure again. This time it was closer, taller, more menacing. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the dim light, watching me with a dead, hollow stare. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, waiting. I felt something brush against my arm, a cold, bony touch that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to fight back, but whatever was out there was far beyond anything I could comprehend. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished. For what felt like hours, I wandered through the woods, not knowing if I was even going in the right direction. I couldn't hear any of my friends, but I knew they couldn't have gone far. The whispering voices persisted, growing louder, more desperate. Finally, I broke through the trees and saw the trailhead, familiar now. The sun was rising, casting long shadows on the ground. My friends were gone, but the figure was nowhere to be seen. I made my way back to the car, breathless and shaken. The forest remained quiet, the eerie calm settling over me like a shroud. My friends were never found. To this day, I've never been able to explain what happened. The woods had taken them, and they took part of me with them, too.